In the spaces between what we know and what we've forgotten, entire worlds once breathed. Libraries turned to ash, cities swallowed by sand, languages that died with their last speaker. These are the silences that hold the deepest truths. Tonight, as sleep calls you toward its gentle embrace, let your mind wander through the corridors of lost time, where knowledge once forbidden now whispers its secrets to those who dare to listen. Here, in the twilight between consciousness and dreams, the forgotten speak loudest. They tell of wisdom buried beneath desert sands, of scrolls that burned with empires, of voices silenced by those who feared what light they might bring to shadows. This is history that was never meant to survive, yet somehow, in fragments and echoes, it calls to us still. Close your eyes. If this mystery were yours, what would you have done? Drop your answer below and subscribe. Some secrets deserve to be remembered. The flames that consumed the great library of Alexandria did not burn for a single day, nor did they spring from a single source. They flickered and danced across centuries, fed by the hands of zealots, conquerors, and time itself. But what was lost in those fires was more than papyrus and ink. It was the accumulated breath of human understanding, the careful observations of minds that dared to question the very foundations of existence. Picture, if you will, the vast halls where Eratosthenes once calculated the circumference of the earth with nothing but shadows and geometry. His measurements, accurate to within a few hundred miles, were preserved on scrolls that crumbled to dust long before Columbus ever set sail. The irony hangs heavy in the air like incense. While medieval Europe insisted the world was flat, the precise dimensions of our sphere had been known and lost again. In those same halls walked Aristarchus, whose revolutionary idea that the Earth orbited the Sun was recorded in texts that fed the flames centuries before Copernicus was born. How different might our world have been if this knowledge had survived? How many Galileos might have been spared the Inquisition's wrath if the truth had simply never been forgotten? The library's scholars preserved the lost plays of Sophocles, not just the 7 that survived, but more than 100 others. Comedies that could make the gods themselves weep with laughter, tragedies that explored the deepest wounds of the human heart. We know their titles from fragments, from references, in other works that themselves barely survived. The Lovers of Achilles, The Shepherds, The Wedding of Helen. Names that echo like the laughter of ghosts. Hero of Alexandria, whose mechanical genius created the first steam engine nearly 2,000 years before the Industrial Revolution, documented his inventions in scrolls that vanished with the library's decline. Imagine a world where steam power arrived with the Roman Empire, where the Dark Ages might never have fallen across Europe because the light of technology burned too bright to extinguish. The library's physicians possessed surgical techniques that would not be rediscovered until the Renaissance. They performed cataract surgeries, understood the circulation of blood, developed anesthetics from plants whose very names are now lost to us. Medical papyri describe treatments that make modern doctors marvel and weep for what might have been. But perhaps the most haunting loss was the collection of the library's logbooks. The careful records of every scholar who had worked there, every text that had been copied, every question that had been posed and answered. These metatexts, the knowledge about knowledge itself, might have been the Rosetta Stone for countless other lost wisdoms. Instead, they became fuel for bathhouse fires, their priceless information warming water for Roman baths. The final scholars of Alexandria knew what was coming. As Christian mobs grew bolder and funding dwindled, they began a desperate effort to preserve what they could. Some texts were hidden in sealed jars, buried in the desert outside the city. Others were smuggled to libraries in Constantinople, Baghdad, or distant monasteries. A few were translated into Arabic or Syriac, languages that might better survive the coming darkness. The mathematician and philosopher Hypatia, torn apart by an angry mob in 415 CE, represented more than just the murder of an individual. She was the living embodiment of the library's spirit, a woman who dared to think freely in an age that increasingly demanded conformity. Her death marked not just the end of a life, but the beginning of an age when asking certain questions could cost you everything. Yet even as Alexandria fell, its treasures scattered like seeds on the wind. In the monasteries of Ireland, monks laboriously copied what texts they could save. In the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, Islamic scholars preserved and expanded upon Greek learning. In the Jewish communities scattered across the Mediterranean, ancient texts survived in hidden archives, waiting for a time when they might safely emerge into the light. 5,000 years ago, where now only dust devils dance across barren plains, a civilization flourished along rivers whose names we do not know, in cities whose purposes we can only guess. The Indus Valley civilization, also called the Harappan culture, left behind the most tantalizing mystery in archaeology. An entire urban society that vanished so completely that we didn't know it existed until the 1920s. Their cities were marvels of planning that would not be matched in the West until the modern era. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Dholavira. Each name rolls off the tongue like an incantation, summoning images of streets laid out in perfect grids, drainage systems more sophisticated than those of medieval London, and public baths that speak of a people who valued cleanliness and community in equal measure. Walk with me through the streets of Mohenjo-Daro as they might have been on a morning 45 centuries ago. The sun rises over flat-roofed houses built of fired brick, each one connected to a municipal drainage system that carried wastewater to covered sewers running beneath the streets. Citizens emerge from homes equipped with private wells and bathing rooms, luxuries that kings in other lands could scarcely imagine. In the Great Bath, a masterwork of waterproofing with tar and gypsum mortar, priests or officials might have performed rituals we can only dream of understanding. The pool measures 39 feet long and 23 feet wide, surrounded by corridors and chambers whose purposes died with their builders. Was this a place of religious purification? A center of governance? A symbol of the civilization's mastery over water itself? The people who built these cities possessed a writing system that taunts us from nearly 4,000 inscribed seals and tablets. Their script, undeciphered to this day, consists of some 400 distinct signs, too many for a simple alphabet, too few for purely pictographic writing. Scholars have spent lifetimes trying to crack this code, applying every computational tool at their disposal. Yet the language remains as silent as the ruined cities themselves. What stories might those seals tell? Each one, carved with the precision of a master craftsman, shows animals both real and mythical alongside the mysterious script. Tigers pace through stone forests, unicorns bow before sacred trees, and elephants trumpet silently across millennia. Were these the marks of merchants, the seals of kings, or something else entirely? Perhaps the literary fragments of a people who recorded their myths and histories in ways we cannot fathom. The uniformity of Harappan civilization across a territory larger than modern Pakistan and northwestern India suggests a level of organization that would have required sophisticated systems of communication and control. Yet we find no palaces, no temples that dwarf all other buildings, no royal tombs stuffed with the wealth of ages. This was a civilization that seemed to value equality over hierarchy, function over display, a social experiment whose results we will never know because the experimenters left no explanation of their methods. Their trade networks stretched from Afghanistan to Gujarat, from the Iranian plateau to the Ganges Valley. Harappan seals have been found in Mesopotamian cities, evidence of commercial relationships that spanned continents. They exported cotton textiles, ivory carvings, and jewelry, so finely wrought that it adorned the courts of Ur and Babylon. In return, they imported gold, silver, and precious stones, weaving themselves into the economic web of the ancient world. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Harappan civilization is how it ended. Around 1900 BCE, the great cities began to decline. Streets that had been maintained for centuries started to crumble. The careful grid patterns of new construction gave way to haphazard building. The sophisticated drainage systems fell into disrepair. It was as if an entire society simply lost the will to maintain the marvels their ancestors had created. Climate change may have played a role. The rivers that sustained these cities were already shifting their courses, and the monsoons that fed them were becoming increasingly unreliable. The Saraswati River, mentioned in the earliest Hindu texts as a mighty waterway, had begun its transformation into the dry channels we see today. As water sources failed, the cities that had been built to celebrate humanity's mastery over the elements found themselves at the mercy of forces they could not control. By 1700 BCE, most of the major Harappan cities lay abandoned, their populations scattered into smaller settlements or migrated to new regions entirely. The urban civilization that had flourished for nearly 1,000 years dissolved like salt in water, leaving behind only brick foundations and the echo of unanswered questions. What songs did they sing in their bathhouses? What prayers did they offer to their unknown gods? What dreams filled their nights, and what hopes drove them to build cities that would outlast their civilization by millennia? These questions hang in the air above the excavated ruins like heat shimmer, visible but always out of reach. The Harappan people became the ancestors of those who followed. Some of their genes flow in the veins of modern South Asians, and perhaps some of their customs survived in traditions that we practice today without understanding their origins. But their writing died with them, and with it went the inner life of a civilization that achieved heights we are only beginning to appreciate. In the summer of 1562, in the plaza of Mani in the Yucatan Peninsula, Spanish Bishop Diego de Landa ordered the burning of thousands of Maya Codices, books that contained the accumulated wisdom of over a millennium of Maya civilization. The smoke that rose from that pyre carried with it the astronomical observations of countless scholars, mathematical innovations that would not be rediscovered in Europe for centuries, and mythological cycles that explained the Maya understanding of cosmic time. Only 4 Maya Codices survived those flames and the centuries that followed. 4 books to represent the literary achievement of a civilization that built massive cities in dense jungle, developed the concept of zero independently of the old world, and created a calendar more accurate than the one Europe was using at the time of the conquest. Imagine what treasures burned in that plaza. Love songs and epic poems, detailed records of planetary movements, medical treatises that describe the healing properties of jungle plants, historical chronicles that trace the rise and fall of kingdoms across the Maya world. The Maya had been writing for over 2,000 years by the time the Spanish arrived. Their script, a complex combination of phonetic symbols and logograms, could express the full range of human thought and emotion. Recent breakthroughs in decipherment have revealed that Maya texts were far more varied and sophisticated than scholars once believed. They wrote not just about kings and conquests, but about ordinary people living their daily lives, merchants calculating profits, farmers tracking the seasons, lovers exchanging poetry written on bark paper that has long since returned to dust. Smaids. Copan, the Maya built a hieroglyphic stairway containing over 2,500 individual glyphs, the longest known Maya text. It tells the story of the city's dynasty across centuries, weaving together history and mythology in a narrative that rivals the epics of ancient Greece. But even this monumental work represents only a fraction of Maya literary achievement. The thousands of books that filled the libraries of cities like Chichen Itza and Tikal would have dwarfed what has survived. The Dresden Codex, one of the 4 surviving books, contains astronomical tables of staggering precision. Maya astronomers tracked the movements of Venus with an accuracy that differs from modern calculations by only 14 seconds per year. They predicted solar eclipses centuries in advance and developed a complex understanding of the relationships between celestial cycles. Their Venus tables, if they had survived in their entirety, would have contained observations spanning millennia, a treasure trove of data that modern astronomers can only dream of possessing. But the Maya were more than astronomers and mathematicians. They were philosophers who grappled with questions of time, identity, and the nature of existence itself. Their concept of time was radically different from the linear progression assumed by most cultures. For the Maya, time moved in cycles within cycles, each completion bringing not an end, but a transformation, a return to origins that was simultaneously a new beginning. Their creation myth, preserved in fragments in the Popol Vuh, tells of multiple attempts by the gods to create beings worthy of worship. The first humans were made of mud and dissolved in the rain. The second were carved from wood, but lacked souls, and were destroyed by the very objects they used. Only the third creation, made from maize dough, produced humans with both substance and spirit. But how many other creation stories burned in the fires of Spanish zeal? How many variations on these themes? How many regional mythologies? How many profound meditations on the human condition went up in smoke? The Maya medical knowledge, recorded in books that describe the properties of hundreds of jungle plants, would have been invaluable to modern medicine. Spanish chroniclers noted that Maya physicians could perform cataract surgery and set broken bones with techniques that impressed even European doctors. Their understanding of herbal remedies was so sophisticated that modern pharmaceutical companies are still discovering active compounds in plants the Maya had used for centuries. Their historical chronicles would have provided an unparalleled window into pre-Columbian American politics and society. The Maya political landscape was complex, with dozens of city-states rising and falling in cycles of alliance and warfare. Their histories, written with the attention to detail that characterizes their astronomical work, would have offered insights into statecraft, economics, and social organization that we can now only guess at from archaeological evidence. The loss becomes even more poignant when we consider that Maya civilization did not end with the Spanish conquest. Maya communities survived, maintaining their languages and many of their traditions. But the knowledge preserved in their books, the accumulation of scientific observation, philosophical reflection, and artistic achievement, was gone forever. Entire lineages of scholars who had dedicated their lives to maintaining and expanding this corpus of knowledge saw their life's work reduced to ash in a single afternoon. Bishop de Landa, who ordered the burning, later attempted to record Maya customs and beliefs in his Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán. His work, while valuable, captures only a fraction of what was lost and filters it through the lens of European understanding. It is as if we tried to reconstruct the entire corpus of Greek literature from the observations of a foreign missionary who had ordered the burning of the Library of Alexandria. The Maya themselves seemed to anticipate this loss. In the final years before the Spanish arrival, many communities began burying their most precious books in sacred caves or sealing them in the walls of temples. Archaeological discoveries continue to uncover fragments of these hidden libraries. A few pages here, a broken tablet there, each one a tantalizing glimpse of the vast literature that once existed. Some Maya priests, realizing that their ancient script might be forgotten, began teaching it to a few trusted students in secret. This knowledge passed down through generations of hidden scholars, men and women who kept the old writing alive in communities that had officially converted to Christianity. When archaeologists finally began to decipher Maya hieroglyphs in the 20th century, these keepers of ancient knowledge emerged from the shadows to help unlock their ancestors' words. Around 1200 BCE, a darkness fell across the ancient Mediterranean world. Powerful civilizations that had stood for centuries crumbled within a few generations. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were abandoned, their Linear B tablets recording final desperate inventories before silence claimed them. The Hittite Empire, which had corresponded as equals with Egypt and Babylon, simply vanished from history. Cities from Troy to Gaza burned, their ashes telling a story of systematic destruction that archaeologists are still trying to understand. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples, but this name tells us almost nothing about who they actually were. In the records of Rameses III, carved into the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu, they appear as a confederation of foreign tribes with names that echo like distant thunder: the Peliset, the Tcheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. They came from the sea, the inscriptions tell us, bringing their families and possessions in ox carts, suggesting not mere raiding, but entire populations in migration. But these Egyptian records, our primary source for the Sea Peoples, were written by their victims and enemies. They tell us what the Sea Peoples destroyed, not who they were or why they came. The silence of the Sea Peoples themselves is one of history's most maddening mysteries. They left no chronicles of their own, no monuments proclaiming their victories, no literature explaining their motivations. They appear in history like a storm, devastating in its effects, inscrutable in its origins. Picture the scene at Pylos around 1180 BCE. The great Mycenaean palace, center of a kingdom that controlled much of the southwestern Peloponnese, receives urgent messages from its watchtowers. Ships have been sighted offshore, not the familiar vessels of traders or allies, but war galleys flying unknown banners. The palace scribes work frantically to inventory the kingdom's military resources, their Linear B tablets recording deployments of troops to coastal positions and desperate requests for bronze to make weapons. Then silence. The palace burns, its administrative quarters destroyed so thoroughly that the clay tablets are baked hard, preserving them for archaeologists to find 3 millennia later. But the people who wrote those tablets, the officials who governed from those halls, the craftsmen who created the magnificent frescoes, they all vanish from the historical record. Pylos becomes just another ruin in a landscape dotted with the remains of a once proud civilization. The pattern repeats across the eastern Mediterranean. At Ugarit, a cosmopolitan trading city that served as a crossroads between the Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Hittite worlds, archaeologists have found a letter that seems to capture the city's final moments. A king of Alashaya, probably Cyprus, writes to his counterpart in Ugarit, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." The letter was found in the ruins of the royal palace, apparently, never sent, as if the end came too quickly for words to travel. Some scholars believe the Sea Peoples were climate refugees, driven from their homelands by drought and famine. The late Bronze Age collapse coincides with evidence of climate change across the Mediterranean. Falling lake levels, abandoned agricultural terraces, and pollen records that suggest widespread deforestation. Perhaps the Sea Peoples were farmers and herders who turned to raiding when their traditional way of life became impossible. Others see them as early examples of what would later be called barbarian migrations, movements of entire peoples seeking new lands to settle. The ox carts mentioned in Egyptian records suggest families on the move, not just warriors on campaign. Perhaps they were fleeing some catastrophe in their original homes, or perhaps they were drawn by the wealth of the established civilizations around the Mediterranean. But there is another possibility, more disturbing in its implications. Some evidence suggests that the Sea Peoples were not entirely foreign to the regions they attacked. Pottery styles and burial practices associated with the Sea Peoples show influences from the very civilizations they destroyed. Could they have been insiders? Displaced populations, disbanded armies, or political refugees who turned against their former masters? The weapons and tactics of the Sea Peoples seem to have given them decisive advantages over the traditional military forces of the late Bronze Age. They used iron weapons when their enemies still relied primarily on bronze. They fought as infantry rather than from chariots, making them more flexible and less dependent on the complex logistical systems that supported chariot warfare. Most importantly, they appear to have understood siege warfare better than their opponents, allowing them to capture fortified cities that had never fallen to assault. The collapse they triggered was not just military, but systemic. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean depended on complex trade networks that linked regions hundreds of miles apart. Tin from Afghanistan was combined with copper from Cyprus to make bronze in workshops from Egypt to Anatolia. When the Sea Peoples disrupted these networks, the entire system collapsed like a house of cards. Cities that had never been directly attacked found themselves cut off from essential resources and gradually abandoned. Writing itself almost disappeared in some regions. The complex administrative systems that had produced thousands of linear B tablets in Mycenaean Greece vanished so completely that the ability to read them was lost for over 3,000 years. The diplomatic correspondence that had connected the great powers of the Late Bronze Age simply stopped. For several centuries, much of the Eastern Mediterranean entered what historians call a Dark Age, a time when monumental architecture ceased, artistic production declined, and the population of many regions dropped dramatically. Yet the Sea Peoples were not merely destroyers. In some regions, they became the foundation of new civilizations. The Philistines, who settled in the coastal regions of what is now Israel and Gaza, were probably one of the Sea Peoples groups. Their distinctive pottery and burial practices show clear connections to the Aegean world, suggesting they brought with them cultural traditions from the regions where the collapse began. They established cities, developed new agricultural techniques, and eventually integrated with the local populations to create a unique hybrid culture. Similarly, some scholars believe that the foundation myths of Rome preserve memories of Sea Peoples' migrations. The stories of Aeneas fleeing Troy to establish a new homeland in Italy might reflect actual movements of Trojan survivors in the wake of their city's destruction. The Roman historians Livy and Tacitus mentioned various peoples who claimed descent from Troy, suggesting that these migration stories were more than mere mythology. But for every successful settlement, there were probably dozens of failed attempts at finding new homes. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Mediterranean shows brief occupations, hastily built fortifications, and signs of conflict that suggest many Sea Peoples groups wandered for years or even decades before finding permanent homes, or disappearing entirely from the historical record. The mystery of the Sea Peoples reminds us how fragile the historical record really is. These people shaped the ancient world as profoundly as any pharaoh or king, yet we know almost nothing about their daily lives, their beliefs, or their understanding of the events they set in motion. They moved through history like ghosts, leaving only the evidence of their passing in the ashes of burned cities and the silence of abandoned palaces. In the end, the Sea Peoples become a metaphor for all the forgotten peoples who shaped history, from the margins, the migrants and refugees, the displaced and dispossessed, whose stories were never recorded by the scribes of the great powers. They remind us that history is written by the literate and the powerful, but made by everyone, including those whose names we will never know and whose voices we will never hear. As the Bronze Age world collapsed around them, the Sea Peoples perhaps understood better than anyone that civilizations are more fragile than they appear, and that the great monuments of human achievement can disappear as quickly as ships on the horizon. In the silence that followed the last echoes of Harappa's bustling markets, another civilization was already stirring in the shadows of time, its own secrets destined to be buried beneath layers of earth and memory. Far to the west, where the Mediterranean-kissed shores that would one day know Greek sandals and Roman legions, the Minoans were weaving their own tapestry of mystery. Crete emerged from the morning mists like a dream half-remembered, its hills rolling toward harbors where ships with painted eyes would soon dock, carrying treasures from lands whose names have been lost to time. Here, in the shadow of mountains that seemed to touch the very realm of the gods, the Minoans built their civilization upon principles that would confound archaeologists millennia later. The great palace of Knossos rose from the earth not through conquest or subjugation, but through an understanding of beauty that seemed to flow from the very stones themselves. Unlike the fortress cities of their contemporaries, these walls welcomed rather than warned. Frescoes bloomed across corridors like gardens of eternal spring, depicting dolphins that danced through painted seas and women who moved with the grace of priestesses performing sacred rites. The bull-leaping ceremonies that took place in the central courtyard were not mere spectacle, but communion with forces that governed both sea and sky. Young athletes, their bronze skin gleaming with oil and determination, would grasp the horns of charging bulls and vault over their backs in displays of courage that bridged the mortal and divine. These were not the brutal entertainments of later Roman amphitheaters, but sacred dances where human and animal moved together in ancient rhythms that spoke of harmony rather than dominance. In the workshops beneath the palace, artisans worked with materials that told stories of trade routes stretching far beyond the known world. Ivory from African elephants was carved into figurines of snake goddesses, whose serpentine arms seemed to writhe with life. Gold from lands beyond the Nile was hammered into delicate jewelry that caught and held the light like captured sunbeams. Each piece was not merely decorative, but served as a link in an invisible chain connecting Crete to civilizations that existed only in whispered tales. The Minoan script, Linear A, remains undeciphered to this day, its symbols etched into clay tablets that were baked to permanence by the very fires that destroyed the civilization that created them. Perhaps this is fitting, for the Minoans seem to have been a people who valued the unspoken, the sacred silence that exists between words. Their tablets may record inventories and administrative details, but their true language was written in the movement of dancers, the patterns of painted pottery, and the careful placement of ritual objects in sacred caves. The goddess they worshipped appeared in many forms, but always with arms outstretched, as if embracing the entire world. She was mother and maiden, earth and sea, the force that made flowers bloom and ships return safely to harbour. Unlike the quarrelling pantheons of later Greek religion, she represented unity, the recognition that all life springs from a single source and returns to that same eternal wellspring. The Minoan understanding of architecture reflected this spiritual philosophy. Their palaces were built without fortification walls, suggesting a level of peace and prosperity that seems almost utopian to modern sensibilities. Trade, not war, was their expansion strategy. Their ships carried not soldiers, but merchants, artists, and perhaps most importantly, ideas. The Minoan influence spread throughout the Aegean, not through conquest, but through the irresistible appeal of their sophisticated culture. Water held special significance in Minoan culture, and elaborate systems of aqueducts, fountains, and baths transformed their palaces into spaces where the boundary between indoor and outdoor space seemed to dissolve. The sound of flowing water was a constant presence, creating an atmosphere of serenity that modern visitors to the ruins still sense when walking through the reconstructed corridors. This was architecture as meditation, building as prayer. The gardens that surrounded these palaces were not mere decoration, but served as outdoor sanctuaries, where the boundaries between cultivated and wild nature were deliberately blurred. Sacred groves, where priestesses conducted rituals under olive, trees that had witnessed centuries of ceremony. The very layout of these spaces suggested a culture that saw itself as part of nature rather than its master, a philosophy that would largely disappear from European thought until the Romantic movement of the 18th century. But even as Minoan, civilization reached its zenith. Forces beyond their control were stirring in the earth beneath their feet. The island of Thera, known today as Santorini, was building toward an eruption that would send shockwaves throughout the ancient world. When it finally came, around 1600 BCE, the explosion was heard across continents, and its ash fell like grey. Snow on lands as distant as Egypt and Anatolia, the immediate effects on Crete were devastating. Tsunamis swept across the northern coast, destroying harbours and inland settlements. The ash cloud that followed blotted out the sun for days, turning the prosperous island into a landscape of grey desolation. But perhaps more damaging than these, immediate catastrophes was the disruption to the trade networks that had been Minoan civilization's lifeblood. Ships that had regularly plied the routes between Crete and the mainland stopped coming. The delicate balance of commerce and cultural exchange that had sustained the Minoan way of life began to crumble. Within a generation, the great palaces were showing signs of decline. Fewer rooms were maintained, fewer frescoes were painted, and gradually, the vibrant culture that had flourished for over a millennium began to fade like watercolors left too long in the sun. The final chapters of Minoan history are written in destruction layers that archaeologists read like a sorrowful narrative. Fire swept through Knossos around 1450 BCE, not the accidental blaze of domestic mishap, but the systematic burning that speaks of human agency. Whether this was internal conflict, invasion by Mycenaean Greeks, or some combination of factors, remains a subject of scholarly debate. What is certain is that the civilization that had given the ancient world its first great maritime culture was coming to an end. Yet even in destruction, the Minoans left gifts for future generations to discover. Their artistic techniques influenced Greek pottery for centuries. Their religious symbols found their way into the mystery cults that would later flourish throughout the Roman Empire. Their very name, given to them by the archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans after the legendary King Minos, ensures that their story remains part of the collective memory of human civilization. While Minoan sailors were navigating by star and wind across the wine-dark sea, another wonder was taking shape in the heart of Anatolia, where the ancient trade routes between Asia and Europe crossed in a landscape of rolling hills and hidden valleys. Çatalhöyük rose from the Konya plain, not as a city in any sense that later civilizations would recognize, but as something entirely new under the sun, a community where the very concepts of street and building, private and public space, were being invented for the first time. The first inhabitants who settled here around 7500 BCE found a landscape blessed by geography and cursed by the very forces that made it fertile. The nearby volcanoes that painted the sky with apocalyptic sunsets also provided the obsidian that would make Çatalhöyük wealthy beyond the dreams of its founders. This volcanic glass, sharper than any metal blade and more valued than gold in the Neolithic world, became the foundation upon which one of humanity's first urban experiments was built. But Çatalhöyük was urban in a way that would seem alien to any modern city dweller. There were no streets in the conventional sense, no grand boulevards or narrow alleys where merchants hawked their wares. Instead, the houses were built directly against one another, creating a honeycomb of humanity, where the roof of one dwelling served as the courtyard of the next. Movement through the settlement required climbing ladders and walking across rooftops in a three-dimensional dance that connected neighbor to neighbor in ways both literal and metaphorical. Entry to each house was through an opening in the roof, requiring visitors to descend wooden ladders into spaces that were simultaneously public and private, sacred and domestic. The main room of each dwelling served as kitchen, workshop, shrine, and burial place, with the dead interred beneath platforms, where the living slept and worked. This intimate relationship with mortality was not morbid, but profoundly spiritual, suggesting a culture that saw death not as ending, but as transformation, a passing from one state of being to another. The walls of these houses bloomed with some of the world's earliest known murals, paintings that transformed domestic spaces into windows onto both the natural and supernatural worlds. Hunt scenes sprawled across interior walls, showing bands of stick-figure humans pursuing wild aurochs and red deer through landscapes populated by vultures whose wingspans dwarfed the hunters below. These were not mere decorations but sacred narratives, visual prayers that connected the residents to the animals whose lives sustained them. But perhaps most remarkable were the paintings that showed Çatalhöyük itself, aerial views of the settlement rendered with a geometric precision that suggests their creators possessed a sophisticated understanding of their built environment. These may be the world's first city plans, created not by professional architects, but by inhabitants who saw their community from perspectives that required them to imagine themselves floating above their own rooftops like gods surveying their creation. The goddess figures found throughout Çatalhöyük speak to a religious understanding that was both sophisticated and deeply rooted in the cycles of natural life. Often depicted giving birth while seated on a throne flanked by leopards or lions, she was simultaneously maternal and fierce, creative and destructive. The reverence shown to these figurines suggests a culture that understood the sacred as flowing through the everyday world, rather than dwelling in distant temples accessible only to specialized priests. Daily life in Çatalhöyük followed rhythms that connected its inhabitants to both cosmic and agricultural cycles. The obsidian workshops buzzed with activity as skilled craftsmen shaped volcanic glass into tools and weapons that would be traded across vast distances. Archaeological evidence suggests that Çatalhöyük obsidian reached settlements hundreds of miles away, carried by traders who helped spread not just materials, but ideas, techniques, and perhaps most importantly, the very concept of urban living. The Dagi burial practices of Çatalhöyük reveal a culture that was both egalitarian and deeply spiritual. Bodies were buried beneath sleeping platforms, with grave goods that suggest a belief in continued existence after death. But the relative lack of variation in burial wealth indicates a society where status differences were minimal. Men and women were buried with similar honors, and children received the same careful treatment as adults, suggesting that the community valued each member regardless of age or gender. Food preparation and consumption were communal activities that took place not in individual kitchens, but in shared courtyards where multiple families would gather to process grain, prepare meals, and share news. The large ovens found in these spaces were capable of feeding dozens of people, indicating that meals were social events that reinforced community bonds. The evidence suggests that Çatalhöyük was organized around extended family groups that shared resources and responsibilities in ways that made survival possible and prosperity achievable. The artistic traditions of Çatalhöyük extended beyond wall paintings to include sophisticated textile work, as evidenced by the many spindle whorls and loom weights found throughout the site. The community's weavers created fabrics that were not merely functional, but were likely decorated with patterns that carried symbolic meaning. Though the organic materials have long since decomposed, the tools they left behind speak to a culture that valued beauty and craftsmanship in the most basic necessities of life. Environmental pressures gradually transformed the landscape around Çatalhöyük in ways that would ultimately challenge the community's survival. Climate change brought drier conditions that made agriculture more difficult. The forests that had provided fuel and building materials began to retreat, forcing inhabitants to travel greater distances for essential resources. The river systems that had made the initial settlement possible shifted their courses, leaving some areas too dry for cultivation while flooding others. Perhaps most significantly, the very success of Çatalhöyük in developing trade networks began to work against its long-term survival. As other settlements learned the techniques of obsidian working and urban planning, Çatalhöyük's competitive advantages diminished. The specialized knowledge that had once made the settlement indispensable became more widely distributed, reducing the community's role as a crucial link in ancient trade networks. The end came not through conquest or catastrophe, but through a gradual process of abandonment that speaks to the pragmatic wisdom of its inhabitants. As resources became scarcer and alternative settlements offered better opportunities, families began to leave for more promising locations. The rooftop highways that had once bustled with activity grew quieter as fewer houses were occupied. Eventually, the community reached a tipping point where the social and economic networks that had sustained urban life could no longer function effectively. The final residents of Çatalhöyük carefully dismantled what they could carry and deliberately sealed their houses before departing, suggesting that they viewed their departure not as defeat, but as transition. They left behind not a ruin but a time capsule, a carefully preserved record of humanity's first experiment in urban living. The settlement was gradually covered by windblown soil and the debris of time, becoming a tell, an artificial hill that preserved layer upon layer of human habitation, like pages in a book waiting to be read. When archaeologists finally began excavating Çatalhöyük in the 1960s, they uncovered not just artifacts and architecture, but evidence of ways of living that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. Here was proof that urban life could exist without kings or temples, that complex societies could function without rigid hierarchies, and that art and spirituality could flourish in the most practical circumstances. As Çatalhöyük's rooftop, pathways fell silent. Another civilization was already reaching toward achievements that would literally move mountains. In the highlands of Armenia, where eagles soar between peaks that seemed to scrape the very floor of heaven, the kingdom of Urartu was carving its name into stone, with a determination that speaks to a people who understood that empires are built, not just through conquest, but through the patient work of engineering eternity. The Urartians emerged from the Bronze Age collapse like survivors of a great storm, inheriting a landscape littered with the ruins of Hittite outposts and Assyrian ambitions. Where others saw destruction, they saw opportunity. The fertile valleys of the Armenian highlands became the foundation for a kingdom that would, at its height, rival even the mighty Assyrian Empire that pressed against its southern borders like a tide that could never quite reach high enough to overwhelm the mountain fortress cities that crowned every strategic peak. The name Urartu itself echoes with the sound of ancient Akkadian texts, where Assyrian scribes recorded their frustrations with these mountain dwellers who refused to submit to lowland authority. Urartu, they wrote, meaning the land of mountains, but the inhabitants themselves called their realm Biainili, a name that survived in hidden valleys long after the kingdom itself had faded into legend. These were the people the Bible would remember as dwelling in the land of Ararat, where Noah's Ark came to rest after the waters of the Great Flood receded. King Arame established the first unified Urartian state around 860 BCE, but it was his successors who would transform a collection of highland tribes into an empire that stretched from the shores of Lake Van to the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains. Sarduri Thawainawain founded the city of Tushpa on the eastern shore of Lake Van, choosing a location that was both naturally defensible and symbolically perfect. The massive rock of Van, rising like a natural citadel from the lake's edge, became the foundation upon which Urartian royal power was literally carved in stone. The inscriptions that cover the Rock of Van speak in cuneiform script of kings who saw themselves as chosen by Kaldi, the supreme god whose name appears in almost every royal proclamation. These were not mere boasts carved for posterity, but sacred texts that transformed the living rock into a temple where the divine and earthly realms intersected. Each inscription was placed with astronomical precision, aligned with the movements of stars and seasons in ways that suggest the Urartians possessed sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics. Water was the secret of Urartian power, and their engineers developed systems of canals and reservoirs that transformed the highland valleys into gardens capable of supporting dense populations. The canal system around Tushpa was so extensive that modern archaeologists initially mistook parts of it for natural streams. These waterworks required not just engineering skill, but a level of social organization that could coordinate the labor of thousands of workers across multiple generations, suggesting a kingdom where royal authority was based on practical benefits rather than mere force. The fortress cities that crowned Urartian peaks were marvels of military architecture that combined defensive necessity with aesthetic beauty. Erebuni, founded by King Argishti I in 782 BCE on a hilltop overlooking the Arax River Valley, featured walls built with such precision that later Armenian builders would use them as foundations for structures that still stand today. The massive stone blocks were fitted together without mortar in techniques that suggest the Urartians had learned construction secrets from the Hittites while developing innovations of their own. The royal palaces within these fortress cities were designed as cosmic maps, with rooms arranged to mirror the movements of celestial bodies and decorative programs that told the story of divine kingship through architectural space. Throne rooms were positioned to catch the first rays of dawn during solstices and equinoxes, while royal tombs were oriented towards specific constellations that held religious significance. These were buildings conceived as instruments for connecting earthly and divine authority. Urartian metallurgy reached levels of sophistication that would not be surpassed in the region for centuries. The bronze cauldrons produced in royal workshops were so highly prized that they were traded throughout the ancient world, reaching as far as Etruscan tombs in Italy and Scythian burial mounds on the Russian steppes. These vessels were not merely functional, but served as diplomatic gifts that carried Urartian artistic influence far beyond the kingdom's political borders. The religious life of Urartu centered on temples that were integrated into the natural landscape in ways that made the entire kingdom a sacred space. Mountain peaks were topped with outdoor altars where priests performed rituals that connected the royal family to the forces that governed weather, fertility, and war. The god Kaldi was worshipped alongside Thespis, the storm god, and Shivini, the sun god, in ceremonies that involved the sacrifice of bulls, whose blood was offered to ensure the continued prosperity of the kingdom. Women held surprisingly prominent positions in Urartian society, as evidenced by royal inscriptions that mention queens as active participants in religious and administrative functions. Some inscriptions suggest that certain queens served as high priestesses with authority that extended beyond ceremonial roles into actual governance. This pattern of female authority may have been inherited from earlier mountain cultures where goddess worship played a central role in community organization. The Urartian language, related to modern Hurrian, but distinct from any contemporary tongue, was preserved in thousands of cuneiform inscriptions that provide intimate glimpses into the daily administration of an ancient kingdom. Royal archives record everything from tax collection in remote villages to the dietary requirements of sacred horses, creating a portrait of a highly organized state where central authority extended into the most remote valleys through networks of appointed officials who reported directly to the king. Trade routes that connected Urartu to the broader ancient world carried more than goods. They carried ideas, technologies, and artistic influences that enriched Urartian culture while spreading highland innovations to distant lands. Urartian horses, bred in highland pastures and trained in mountain warfare, were prized throughout the Near East. Urartian iron weapons, forged with techniques that produced superior steel, were copied by smiths from Anatolia to Iran. The decline of Urartu began in the late 7th century BCE when Scythian tribes, displaced by events on the Eurasian steppes, began pressing into Urartian territory from the north. These were not the organized armies that Urartian military engineers had designed their fortresses to repel, but waves of nomadic warriors whose mobility and ferocity overwhelmed defensive positions that had never been tested against such tactics. Simultaneously, the Assyrian Empire, weakened by its own internal conflicts, could no longer serve as a buffer against tribal movements from the east. Cimmerian raiders, following paths through the Caucasus Mountains that bypassed Urartian strongholds, began attacking settlements in the Armenian valleys. The careful balance of alliances and enmities that had sustained Urartian foreign policy for centuries collapsed as the ancient world entered a period of unprecedented upheaval. The final blow came not from external invasion, but from internal dissolution. The elaborate administrative system that had been Urartu's strength became its weakness as regional governors, cut off from central authority by constant warfare, began acting as independent rulers. The kingdom fragmented into competing principalities that lacked the resources to maintain the canal systems and fortress networks that had made Urartian civilization possible. By 600 BCE, the last Urartian king had vanished from the historical record, leaving behind only the massive stone constructions that had been built to last forever. The kingdom's fall was so complete that within a few generations, even the location of Tushpa was forgotten by the peoples who inherited the Armenian highlands. The great fortress cities became homes for goat herds and bandits, their royal inscriptions serving as convenient surfaces for later graffiti that obliterated the memory of the kings who had carved their names in stone with such confidence. Yet Urartu did not disappear entirely. The engineering techniques developed by Urartian water specialists continued to be used by later inhabitants of the Armenian highlands. The artistic motifs that decorated Urartian metalwork influenced the visual culture of successor peoples. Most importantly, the very concept of Armenia as a distinct cultural region was defined by the geographical boundaries that Urartu had established through centuries of patient conquest and administration. When archaeologists began excavating Urartian sites in the 20th century, they discovered not just ruins, but evidence of a sophisticated civilization that had been virtually erased from historical memory. The cuneiform inscriptions that covered the Rock of Van were gradually deciphered, revealing the names of kings and gods that had been silent for more than 2 millennia. Museum collections around the world began to display Eurasian bronzes and jewelry that demonstrated levels of artistic achievement that rivaled anything produced in contemporary Assyria or Babylon. Today, the ruins of Erebuni overlook the modern city of Yerevan, serving as a reminder that civilizations rise and fall, with a regularity that should inspire both humility and wonder. The fortress walls that once defended Urartian kings now protect only memories, but those memories speak to the enduring human capacity to build something beautiful and lasting, even in the knowledge that nothing built by human hands can truly last forever. In the silence that surrounds these ancient stones, patient ears can still hear echoes of the horns that once announced the arrival of kings, whose names are now known only to scholars, and whose kingdoms have become footnotes in the longer story of human ambition and achievement. Across the rushing waters of the blue and white Nile, where the rivers converged in their eternal dance toward the Mediterranean, there rose a kingdom whose very existence has been whispered away by the winds of time. The kingdom of Kush, ancient Nubia, stood as a testament to African power that once made even mighty Egypt bow its head in reverence. Yet today, few remember the names of the Kandakes, the warrior queens who wore crowns of gold and commanded armies that stretched from the cataracts of the Nile to the highlands of Ethiopia. In the shadow of Egypt's towering monuments, the Kushite rulers built their own pyramids at Meroe, Nuri, and El Kuru. These were not mere imitations, but proud declarations of an independent civilization that had absorbed the best of Egyptian culture while maintaining its own distinctive character. The sandstone blocks, weathered now by millennia of desert winds, once gleamed in the African sun as pharaohs with skin dark as ebony ruled over lands both north and south of their capital, Pi the Great, whose name echoes only faintly through archaeological records, was the first of the Kushite pharaohs to truly unite the two lands. In 747 BCE, his armies swept northward like a flooding Nile, carrying banners that bore the symbols of both Amun-Ra and the distinctly Nubian lion god, Apetamak. The Egyptian nobles, weakened by centuries of division, found themselves facing warriors whose bronze-tipped spears gleamed with the certainty of divine mandate. What the world has forgotten is the profound reverence these Kushite rulers held for the very traditions their conquest might have destroyed. Pi's victory stela, carved in hieroglyphs as precise as any produced in Memphis or Thebes, tells not of destruction but of restoration. He came not as a conqueror but as a restorer of Ma'at, the cosmic order that had been shattered by Egyptian civil wars. His horses, bred in the highlands of Nubia, were said to be swifter than the wind, and his soldiers fought with the discipline of those who believed they carried the favor of the gods. The weight of his crown was not merely gold and precious stones, but the accumulated responsibility of two ancient civilizations. In the temples of Karnak, Pi performed the same rituals as his Egyptian predecessors, offering incense to Amun while maintaining the distinctly Nubian traditions that honored the ancestors of his highland kingdom. This was a synthesis the ancient world had never seen. African leadership embracing and perfecting the cultural achievements of their northern neighbors while never abandoning their own heritage. Successive Kushite pharaohs, Shabaka, Shebitku, and the Great Taharka, continued this delicate balance. Taharka, whose reign stretched for 26 years, became the most powerful ruler in the ancient world, controlling territory from the Mediterranean to the confluence of the Blue and White Niles. His monuments rose not only in Nubia, but throughout Egypt, and his name appeared in the annals of Assyrian kings who spoke of him with grudging respect. Yet it was a woman who perhaps embodied the true spirit of Kushite royalty. The Kandakes, a title meaning Queen Mother, ruled in their own right, commanding armies and conducting diplomacy with the great powers of the ancient world. Queen Amanirenas, whose tomb lies beneath the shifting sands near Meroe, led her warriors against the legions of Augustus Caesar himself. Roman historians, writing with the casual dismissiveness of their era, recorded these encounters as minor skirmishes on the empire's periphery. But the truth, preserved in Meroitic inscriptions that scholars are still learning to read, tells of a 3-year war in which Roman pride was humbled by African steel. The Roman historian Strabo, writing with begrudging admiration, described Amanirenas as a woman of masculine courage who had lost an eye in battle, yet continued to lead her troops from the front lines. When Augustus's prefect demanded tribute, she reportedly sent him a bundle of arrows with the message that these were gifts for Caesar. He could choose whether to receive them as presents or weapons. The diplomatic solution that eventually emerged saw Rome withdrawing from Kushite territory, a rare instance of the empire acknowledging the sovereignty of an African power. The Meroitic script, unique among ancient writing systems, preserved the voices of these rulers in a language that scholars are only beginning to understand, unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, which recorded the formal language of the state. Meroitic inscriptions seem to capture something more intimate. Royal decrees that speak directly to the people. Funeral texts that mourn not just the passing of kings, but the grief of entire communities. These stone tablets, scattered across archaeological sites from Aswan to Sennar, represent one of humanity's great linguistic mysteries, a royal language that died with the kingdom that created it. The wealth that supported this forgotten empire came not merely from the gold mines of the Nubian desert, though those mines were legendary throughout the ancient world. Iron production, mastered earlier and more thoroughly in Kush than in Egypt, provided both weapons and trade goods. The furnaces of Meroe, their slag heaps still visible today, produced steel of such quality that Kushite weapons were prized throughout the Mediterranean world. This technological superiority, combined with the kingdom's position as a conduit for trade between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean, created a prosperity that lasted for over 1,000 years. Elephants, trained for warfare in the highlands of Ethiopia, formed the backbone of Kushite military power. These were not the Asian elephants that Hannibal famously led across the Alps, but African bush elephants, larger and more temperamental, their ivory tusks bound with bronze, and their massive foreheads protected by armor of hammered copper. Greek and Roman accounts describe these creatures as mobile fortresses, each carrying a platform with archers whose arrows could pierce enemy lines from above the reach of conventional weapons. The decline of Kush came not through conquest, but through the shifting currents of trade and climate. As the Roman Empire turned inward during its centuries of crisis, Mediterranean demand for African goods declined. Simultaneously, the rise of Axum in what is now Ethiopia provided an alternative route for trade between the African interior and the Red Sea ports. The Nile, which had been Kush's highway to wealth, became increasingly irrelevant as maritime trade routes developed along the African coast. Christianity's arrival in Nubia marked both transformation and continuity. The great temples of Meroe were gradually abandoned, their stones sometimes incorporated into the walls of new churches. Yet the conversion was not a conquest, but an evolution. As Nubian Christianity developed its own distinctive character, incorporating traditions that stretch back to the Pharaonic period, the Kingdom of Koguryo, which emerged from Kush's ashes, maintained many of the ancient political structures while embracing the new faith with characteristic Nubian determination. In the mist-shrouded mountains where China meets Korea, where the Yalu River carves its ancient path toward the Yellow Sea, there once stood a kingdom whose very existence challenged the celestial pretensions of Chinese emperors. Koguryo, the northernmost of the 3 kingdoms of ancient Korea, ruled for 7 centuries over territories that encompassed not only the Korean peninsula, but vast swaths of Manchuria and Inner Mongolia. Yet today, this kingdom's name survives, primarily in the footnotes of Chinese histories and the passionate arguments of Korean scholars fighting to preserve their ancestors' memory. The legendary founder, Jumong, was said to have been born from an egg kissed by sunlight, his divine parentage marking him as a ruler chosen by heaven itself. Whether one believes in such mythological origins or not, the archaeological evidence speaks clearly. By the 1st century BCE, the Koguryo kingdom had established itself as a power capable of challenging both Chinese armies and the nomadic tribes of the northern steppes. Their capital at Jolbon, hidden deep in the mountains of what is now North Korea, was designed not merely as a city, but as a fortress that could withstand siege by any army in the known world. What made Koguryo remarkable was not simply its military prowess, though that was legendary, but its position as a cultural bridge between the sedentary civilizations of China and Korea and the nomadic peoples of the northern steppes. Koguryo warriors fought on horseback with the mobility of steppe nomads, yet they also built massive stone fortresses with the engineering skill of Chinese architects. Their royal tombs, scattered across the countryside near modern-day Pyongyang, contain murals that blend Chinese artistic techniques with distinctly Korean subjects. Hunting scenes that show mounted nobles pursuing tigers through forests that could only exist in the Korean highlands. King Gwanggaeto the Great, whose full title proclaimed him ruler who expanded territory, embodied the imperial ambitions that drove Koguryo to its greatest extent. The massive stone stele erected in his honor near modern-day Jian stands over 20 feet tall, its weathered surface carved with an inscription that reads like an ancient declaration of independence, in Chinese characters that proclaim Korean achievements. It records Gwanggaeto's victories over Chinese armies, Japanese raiders, and various tribal confederations that had dared to challenge Koguryo's expanding borders. The inscription is a fascinating document of royal propaganda, yet also a window into the complex political dynamics of ancient Northeast Asia. Gwanggaeto claimed to have destroyed Japanese armies attempting to establish footholds on the Korean peninsula, launched punitive expeditions against Chinese warlords who refused to acknowledge Koguryo's sovereignty, and brought order to tribal regions that had known only chaos. Whether all these claims were literally true matters, less than what they reveal about Koguryo's self-perception as the dominant power in its region. Chinese historians, writing from the perspective of the Middle Kingdom's eternal centrality, consistently describe Koguryo as a rebellious vassal state that periodically needed to be chastised for its presumption. Yet the archaeological evidence tells a different story. Koguryo's capital cities were built on a scale that rivaled anything in contemporary China, their palaces decorated with murals that showed no deference to Chinese aesthetic preferences. The tomb of King Dongmyong, with its famous hunting murals, depicts a royal court where Korean nobles wear distinctly Korean costumes while engaging in activities, particularly hunting and feasting, that emphasized their connection to the land rather than to abstract philosophical concepts of Chinese governance. The kingdom's administrative system, while borrowing certain Chinese innovations, maintained distinctly Korean characteristics. Royal succession often involved complex negotiations between powerful noble families rather than the strict patrilineal inheritance that Chinese dynasties preferred. Women, while not ruling directly, exercised considerable political influence, and some of the most important diplomatic missions were conducted by court ladies, whose skills in negotiation were apparently legendary. Koguryo's military innovations deserve particular attention as they represent one of the few instances in ancient warfare where a smaller kingdom successfully resisted Chinese expansion for centuries. Their heavy cavalry, equipped with iron armor and wielding long lances, proved superior to Chinese infantry formations in the mountainous terrain that characterized much of their territory. More importantly, they perfected siege techniques that allowed them to capture Chinese fortified cities, something that required not only military skill, but also sophisticated engineering knowledge. The kingdom's relationship with Buddhism provides another fascinating glimpse into its cultural independence. While Chinese Buddhism emphasized meditation and scholarly study, Koguryo Buddhism developed a more martial character, with warrior monks who served both spiritual and military functions. The great temple complexes that dotted the Koguryo landscape combined Chinese architectural elements with Korean innovations, particularly in their use of natural settings that integrated buildings with the mountainous landscape rather than imposing geometric order upon it. King Yon Gaesomun, the last great ruler of Koguryo, exemplified both the kingdom's strength and the challenges it faced. Rising to power through what Chinese sources describe as a coup but Korean sources present as a necessary restoration of royal authority, he consolidated Koguryo's military forces for what he correctly perceived would be a final struggle for survival. The Tang dynasty, having unified China under strong central authority, could no longer tolerate an independent Korean kingdom that controlled territory reaching almost to Beijing itself. The Chinese invasion that finally brought down Koguryo involved the largest military expedition in Chinese history up to that point. Emperor Gaozong personally led armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, supported by siege engines that represented the most advanced military technology of the time. Yet even this massive force required the alliance with the southern Korean kingdom of Silla to finally overcome Koguryo's defenses. The siege of Pyongyang, the final Koguryo capital, lasted for months and required the Chinese to construct engineering works that diverted entire rivers to breach the city's walls. What the Chinese records do not adequately convey is the human cost of Koguryo's destruction. When the kingdom finally fell in 676 CE, entire populations were forcibly relocated to distant parts of the Chinese Empire. Noble families that had ruled in the Korean mountains for centuries found themselves scattered across China as hostages to ensure continued peace. The great fortresses were systematically demolished, their massive stone blocks sometimes incorporated into Chinese construction projects, but more often simply abandoned to decay in the mountain valleys where they had once represented Korean independence. Yet Koguryo's legacy proved impossible to erase completely. The Kingdom of Goryeo, which emerged several centuries later and eventually gave its name to modern Korea, explicitly claimed succession from the ancient mountain kingdom. Goryeo's founder, Wanggeon, established his capital at Songgak, modern Kaesong, partly because of its proximity to former Koguryo territories, and his royal proclamations consistently emphasized the restoration of Korean independence after centuries of foreign domination. The tomb murals of Koguryo, scattered across North Korean and Chinese archaeological sites, remain among the most vivid artistic achievements of ancient Korea. Unlike Chinese tomb paintings, which typically focused on abstract themes of cosmic order and imperial virtue, Koguryo murals celebrate the physical world, hunting expeditions through autumn forests, court festivities where nobles dance to music that seems almost audible across the centuries, and military ceremonies where armor-clad warriors display the weapons that defended Korean independence for 700 years. Along the emerald coast of what the modern world calls Vietnam, where monsoon winds carried ships laden with spices between the ports of China and the markets of India, there flourished a maritime kingdom whose very existence has been obscured by the larger narratives of Vietnamese and Chinese history. The Kingdom of Champa, ruled by kings who traced their divine authority to the Hindu god Shiva, commanded the sea lanes of Southeast Asia for over 15 centuries, their fleets carrying not only trade goods, but also the cultural synthesis that defined medieval maritime Asia. The Cham people, speakers of an Austronesian language more closely related to Malay and Tagalog than to Vietnamese, built their civilization around the worship of Shiva, in his aspect as Po Naga, the goddess protector of sailors and merchants. Their temples, constructed from red sandstone that glowed like fire in the tropical sunset, rose from coastal plains and river deltas in architectural forms that blended Indian religious concepts with distinctly Southeast Asian aesthetic preferences. The temple complex at Mai Son, hidden in the jungle-covered mountains of central Vietnam, represents one of the finest examples of Hindu architecture outside the Indian subcontinent. Yet its sculptural details reflect a cultural sensibility that was purely Cham. King Jaya Indravarman II, who ruled during the kingdom's golden age in the 13th century, embodied the cosmopolitan character that made Champa unique among Southeast Asian kingdoms. Court inscriptions describe him as equally fluent in Sanskrit, Cham, and Chinese, capable of conducting diplomatic negotiations with Mongol envoys while simultaneously patronizing Hindu scholars who translated ancient Indian texts into the Cham script. His capital at Vijaya, located near modern-day Quainon, was designed according to Hindu cosmological principles, yet incorporated Chinese-influenced gardens and Malay-style royal pavilions that reflected the diverse cultural influences flowing through his kingdom. The wealth that supported this cultural flowering came primarily from Champa's control of the maritime trade routes connecting China with the Indian Ocean. Cham ports served as essential stopping points for Chinese junks sailing southwest toward Malacca and Indian dhows heading northeast toward Canton. The kingdom's strategic position allowed Cham rulers to levy taxes on this trade, while also serving as cultural intermediaries who facilitated not only commercial exchanges, but also the transmission of religious ideas, artistic techniques, and technological innovations across the vast expanse of maritime Asia. What made Cham civilization distinctive was its synthesis of Hindu religious traditions with maritime commercial culture. Unlike the land-based kingdoms of Angkor or Pagan, where royal authority derived primarily from control of agricultural populations and water management systems, Cham kings ruled over a society of sailors, merchants, and craftsmen whose prosperity depended on maintaining connections with distant ports rather than controlling local territory. This gave Cham culture a cosmopolitan character that was unusual in medieval Southeast Asia, as merchants from across the known world gathered in Cham ports to exchange not only goods but also ideas. The architectural achievements of the Cham kingdom reflect this cultural complexity. The Ponagar temple complex at Nha Trang, dedicated to the goddess who protected sailors, incorporates architectural elements that can be traced to the Pallava temples of South India, yet its overall design reflects purely local innovations. The temple towers, built without mortar using a technique that allowed massive sandstone blocks to interlock through precise carving, have withstood centuries of tropical storms and earthquakes. Their sculptural decorations depict Hindu deities in forms that would be recognizable to any Indian devotee. Yet the surrounding figures, musicians, dancers, and court officials, wear distinctly Cham clothing and jewelry. The Cham script, derived from ancient Brahmi, but evolved to represent the unique phonetic characteristics of the Cham language, preserved a literary tradition that included not only Hindu religious texts, but also indigenous works of poetry and historical chronicle. The Cham epic of Bok Kleng, which recounts the legendary adventures of a hero who travels across the South China Sea to rescue a princess from Chinese captivity, represents one of the finest examples of maritime adventure literature in any Southeast Asian language. Its descriptions of sea voyages, storm-tossed ships, and encounters with supernatural beings that inhabit remote islands reflect the lived experience of a people whose cultural imagination was shaped by the rhythm of monsoons and the vast horizons of the open ocean. Queen Po Inu Nagar, whose reign in the 10th century marked one of the high points of Cham cultural achievement, exemplified the important role that women played in Cham society. Unlike the strictly patriarchal systems that characterized most contemporary Asian kingdoms, Cham royal succession could pass through female lines, and queens often ruled in their own right, rather than as regents for male heirs. Po Inu Nagar's inscriptions, carved in both Sanskrit and Cham, describe extensive building projects that included not only temples, but also irrigation systems, bridges, and harbour facilities that supported the kingdom's commercial prosperity. The gradual decline of Champa resulted from changes in maritime trade patterns that the kingdom could not control. The rise of Malacca as a major entrepot in the 15th century, combined with the expansion of Vietnamese agricultural settlements southward along the coast, gradually reduced Cham territorial control and commercial influence. The Portuguese arrival in Southeast Asian waters introduced new trade routes that bypassed traditional Cham ports, while the Spanish colonization of the Philippines created alternative pathways for goods flowing between China and the Indian Ocean. Yet, the most devastating blow to Cham independence came from the systematic Vietnamese expansion southward, a process that Vietnamese historians celebrate as the March to the South, but which Cham sources describe as a series of increasingly destructive invasions that culminated in the complete annexation of their ancestral lands. The Vietnamese conquest was not merely political, but cultural, as Vietnamese administrators actively suppressed Cham religious practices, confiscated temple lands, and encouraged Vietnamese agricultural settlement in areas that had been Cham population centers for centuries. The last independent Cham kingdom, centered on the Mekong Delta region that the Vietnamese called Cochinchina, survived until the 19th century, largely because its remote location and the complexity of the delta's waterways made direct administrative control difficult. King Po Chien, who ruled during the final decades of Cham independence, maintained the traditional forms of Hindu kingship, even as his territory shrunk to a few islands in the Mekong estuary. His court, described by French visitors as a curious survival of medieval Hindu civilization in the age of European colonialism, continued to perform the ancient ceremonies that connected Cham rulers to the cosmic order of Shiva and Vishnu. The French colonial conquest of Indochina in the mid-19th century marked the end of even nominal Cham independence, yet also, paradoxically, provided the first serious European documentation of Cham cultural achievements. French archaeologists and historians, trained in the Orientalist scholarship of their era, recognized the importance of Cham architectural and literary traditions, even as colonial administrators implemented policies that further marginalized the Cham people within the emerging structure of French Indochina. Today, the descendants of the Cham kingdom constitute minority communities in both Vietnam and Cambodia, their traditional culture preserved primarily in rural areas where ancient temples still serve as centers of religious life. The Cham language, written in a script that preserves echoes of ancient Sanskrit, continues to be spoken in villages scattered along the coast, where Cham fishing boats still set out each morning for waters that once carried the trade fleets of kings who ruled from cities that gleamed like jade in the tropical sun. The temple towers that rise from rice fields and fishing villages throughout central and southern Vietnam stand as silent testimony to a civilization that connected the cultural worlds of India and China through the medium of maritime commerce. Their weathered sandstone surfaces, carved with images of Hindu deities dancing eternal dances, represent not merely the artistic achievements of a vanished kingdom, but the cultural synthesis that made medieval Southeast Asia one of the most cosmopolitan regions in the pre-modern world. In the marshy delta of the Nile, where the great river fragments into countless channels before surrendering its waters to the Mediterranean, archaeologists in the 20th century uncovered treasures that rivaled those of Tutankhamun, yet remained largely unknown to the world beyond scholarly circles. The city of Tanis, biblical Zoan, served as the capital of Egypt during the 21st and 22nd dynasties, a period when pharaohs ruled from the delta rather than from the traditional centers of Memphis or Thebes. These were the pharaohs, whom the Bible remembered as the oppressors of the Israelites, yet whose own inscriptions reveal rulers struggling to maintain the dignity of pharaonic tradition during an age when Egypt's ancient glory had begun to fade. The discovery of the royal tombs at Tanis by French archaeologist Pierre Montet represents one of the great archaeological achievements of the modern era. Yet it occurred during World War II, when the world's attention was focused elsewhere. Unlike the tomb of Tutankhamun, which had been robbed and restored multiple times in antiquity, the Tanis burials remained essentially intact. Their golden treasures and royal mummies preserved exactly as ancient priests had arranged them over 3,000 years ago. The irony that such a spectacular discovery should be overshadowed by global conflict seems appropriate for a dynasty that ruled during Egypt's own age of diminished international prominence. Susanès I, whose silver coffin was found nested within a black granite sarcophagus that had originally been carved for a much earlier pharaoh, exemplified both the continuity and the transformation that characterized the Tanite period. His burial equipment, while magnificent, showed clear signs of the economic constraints that limited royal resources during the Third Intermediate period. Golden jewelry that would have been solid in earlier eras was now hollow and precious. Vessels were often reworked from objects that had originally been created for other purposes. Yet the craftsmanship remained superb, and the religious symbolism preserved all the ancient associations between pharaonic authority and divine power. The shift of Egypt's political center to Tanis reflected larger changes in the Mediterranean world that were gradually reducing Egypt's international influence. The collapse of the Bronze Age trading system had eliminated many of the commercial relationships that had brought wealth and exotic materials to pharaonic Egypt. Meanwhile, the rise of Assyrian power in Mesopotamia created military pressures that forced Egyptian rulers to concentrate their resources on defending the Delta region, rather than projecting power southward into Nubia or northward into the Levant. What the Tanite pharaohs understood, perhaps better than their predecessors, was that Egypt's survival as an independent kingdom required adaptation to these new circumstances, rather than futile attempts to restore the imperial glory of the new kingdom. King Amenemope, whose tomb yielded some of the finest examples of Third Intermediate Period goldwork, seems to have focused his reign on internal consolidation rather than foreign adventure. His inscriptions emphasize his role as a protector of temple properties and a patron of traditional religious observances, suggesting a conscious effort to maintain pharaonic legitimacy through religious rather than military means. The artistic achievements of the Tanite period, while different in scale from those of Egypt's imperial age, demonstrate remarkable creativity within the constraints imposed by reduced resources. The golden masks that covered the faces of royal mummies, while smaller than those of earlier periods, display a refinement of technique that surpassed even the famous mask of Tutankhamun. The use of colored glass inlays to represent the eyes and eyebrows created an effect of lifelike intensity that seemed to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Religious innovations during the Tanite period reflected the decentralized political structure that characterized Egypt during the Third Intermediate Period. Unlike the highly centralized temple system that had supported earlier pharaohs, the Tanite rulers governed through alliances with regional priest-kings who controlled their own temple estates and military forces. This created a more complex, religious landscape where local traditions that had been suppressed during the New Kingdom's imperial period experienced revival and elaboration. The tomb of Sheshonq II, discovered within the burial complex of Susenes Iers, provides fascinating evidence of the international connections that the Tanite pharaohs maintained despite Egypt's reduced circumstances. His burial equipment included objects that could only have come from contemporary workshops in Phoenicia, Assyria, and Nubia, suggesting that Egyptian diplomatic and commercial networks, while diminished, remained extensive. A golden bracelet, bearing the name of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, represents one of the few direct archaeological links between Egyptian and Mesopotamian royal courts during this period. The biblical account of Pharaoh Shishak's invasion of Israel, recorded in the books of Kings and Chronicles, provides a rare glimpse of Tanite military capabilities during their brief period of renewed expansionism. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Palestine confirms that Egyptian armies did indeed campaign in the region during the reign of Sheshonq I. Yet the scale of these operations was modest compared to the massive military expeditions that earlier pharaohs had launched into the Levant. This was warfare conducted for limited objectives rather than imperial conquest, designed to secure Egypt's northeastern frontier rather than to establish permanent Egyptian control over foreign territories. The gradual decline of the Tanite dynasties resulted from the same factors that had originally brought them to power: the fragmentation of Egypt into competing regional power centers that made unified resistance to foreign invasion increasingly difficult. The Nubian conquest of Egypt in the 8th century BCE marked the end of Tanite independence, yet also, paradoxically, the beginning of a cultural revival that drew heavily on Tanite precedents. The Nubian pharaohs, who established their own capital at Memphis, consciously emulated Tanite royal ideology while adapting it to their own political needs. The modern rediscovery of Tanis and its treasures has provided historians with unprecedented insight into a period of Egyptian history that textual sources had obscured. The material culture preserved in the royal tombs reveals a civilization that, while no longer capable of the monumental achievements of the Pyramid Age or the New Kingdom, maintained sophisticated artistic traditions and complex religious practices. The golden jewelry, silver vessels, and precious amulets that adorned the Tanite pharaohs in death represent not merely personal possessions, but symbols of a royal ideology that successfully adapted ancient Egyptian concepts of divine kingship to the political realities of the Iron Age. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Tanite legacy is how completely it vanished from popular memory, despite the spectacular nature of its archaeological remains. While tourists flock to see the treasures of Tutankhamun in Cairo's Egyptian Museum, the equally magnificent burial goods of Psusenes, I remain virtually unknown outside scholarly circles. This paradox reflects the broader pattern by which historical memory is shaped not only by the significance of past events, but also by the circumstances of their modern rediscovery and the political context that determine which aspects of the past receive public attention. The golden mask of Susenfreur, with its serene expression and exquisite craftsmanship, gazes upward with the same eternal confidence that characterizes all pharaonic funerary art. Yet there is something poignant about this particular image of royal dignity preserved in precious metal, a reminder that even in ages of decline, human creativity and religious devotion could produce works of lasting beauty. The silence that has surrounded the Tanite pharaohs in modern popular consciousness may itself be temporary, another layer of forgetting that future generations will sweep away as they construct their own relationships with the deep past. Thus, royal gardens of Angkor had become wild again, their carefully tended lotus pools now choked with water, hyacinth and thyme. Where once the god-kings of the Khmer had walked between perfectly aligned stone channels, now only the rustle of leaves marked the hours. The hydraulic marvels that had sustained 1,000,000 souls lay buried beneath centuries of silt and silence, their engineering genius reduced to broken stones that archaeologists would puzzle over like fragments of a forgotten language. In the dying light of the 12th century, as Angkor Wat's towers still caught the last rays of sun, the great city was already beginning its retreat into memory. The monsoons that had once filled the vast network of berets and channels now carved new paths through abandoned temples. The sophisticated understanding of water management, of seasonal cycles and agricultural timing that had built an empire, was flowing away like water through cupped hands. But perhaps the greatest loss was not the infrastructure itself, but the accumulated wisdom that had created it. In the scriptoriums of the royal palace, where learned Brahmins had once calculated the precise movements of planets and the optimal times for planting, manuscripts were crumbling unread. The knowledge of how to read the sky, how to predict the behavior of the great river systems, how to balance the needs of rice cultivation with the demands of an expanding population, all of this began to fade as the court abandoned the ancient capital for newer, smaller centers of power. The children who grew up in the villages surrounding the empty temples never learned the old ways of reading the stone inscriptions that lined the causeways. They could not decipher the astronomical alignments built into every major structure, or understand why their ancestors had positioned certain buildings to catch specific angles of sunlight at crucial moments in the agricultural calendar. The sophisticated bronze working techniques that had created the intricate temple bells fell into disuse. The secret of mixing the particular lime mortar that had held the massive sandstone blocks together for centuries was forgotten within a generation. Yet in the jungle's embrace of the abandoned city, something else was being preserved. The very overgrowth that seemed to be destroying the temples was also protecting them, cushioning ancient stones from the extremes of weather, filtering harsh sunlight through green canopies, creating the humid, stable environment that would keep the greatest architectural achievements intact for future discovery. The silk cotton trees that split apart gallery walls were also holding them together with their roots, creating a new kind of architecture where stone and wood, human intention and natural force merged into something unprecedented. This was the paradox of lost knowledge, that sometimes it survived precisely because it was forgotten, because it fell out of human reach and into the keeping of other forces. The medicinal practices of the Khmer court physicians, preserved in palm leaf manuscripts that crumbled away in palace libraries, lived on in the folk remedies of village healers, who had learned their arts not from books, but from direct transmission, grandmother to granddaughter, through the very generations that had witnessed the great city's decline. In the mountains of Tibet, another kind of forgetting was taking place. The vast libraries of Sami Monastery, where Buddhist scholars had spent centuries translating Sanskrit texts into Tibetan, preserving philosophical works that were being lost in their original homelands, faced their own form of disappearance. Political upheavals and religious persecutions scattered the monks who had maintained these collections across generations. Manuscripts that represented thousands of years of accumulated spiritual and philosophical insight were buried in caves, hidden in remote locations, where they might survive the immediate crisis, but where their accessibility to future scholars became uncertain. The irony was profound. These texts, originally translated to preserve knowledge that was vanishing from India, were now themselves becoming lost knowledge. The sophisticated debates about consciousness and reality, the detailed maps of meditative states, the careful instructions for practices that could supposedly reveal the deepest nature of mind, all of this was being wrapped in yak hide and sealed into darkness, waiting for political climates that might never come. Some monks, recognizing the precariousness of their situation, began the patient work of memorization that had been practiced for centuries, but now took on desperate urgency. They would spend years learning entire texts by heart, becoming human, libraries who could carry vast stores of knowledge in their minds alone. But human memory, however trained, was still fragile. When these walking libraries died without finding suitable students, entire lineages of understanding died with them. In the cold halls of Irish monasteries, a different crisis was unfolding. The Viking raids that had begun as seasonal attacks on coastal settlements were becoming systematic campaigns that targeted the very centres of learning that had made Ireland the scholarly heart of medieval Europe. The monasteries of Clonmacnoise and Glendalough, where monks had spent centuries copying classical texts, creating illuminated manuscripts, and developing mathematical and astronomical knowledge, found their libraries burning on the pyres of conquest. The Book of Kells, that extraordinary fusion of Celtic artistry and Christian devotion, survived only because some monk had the presence of mind to hide it during a raid. But how many other illuminated manuscripts, how many copied works of classical philosophy and science, how many original Irish innovations in literature and learning went up in smoke during those dark centuries? The monks who had preserved so much knowledge from the collapse of the Roman Empire were now watching their own accumulated wisdom disappear in the same way, through fire and sword and the simple brutality of those who saw no value in written learning. Yet even as the monasteries burned, the knowledge they had contained was already spreading in ways the Vikings could not track or destroy. Irish monks had been wandering across Europe for generations, carrying their learning to courts, and churches from Iceland to Italy, the mathematical concepts they had developed, the astronomical observations they had recorded, the linguistic insights they had gained from working with multiple languages simultaneously, all of this had been shared and adapted and built upon, in locations far from the original centres of Irish learning. In the Great Library of Córdoba, Muslim scholars were working with texts that had travelled impossible distances and survived improbable dangers to reach their shelves. Greek philosophical works, translated into Syriac during the early centuries of Christianity, then into Arabic during the Islamic expansion, were being translated yet again into Latin by Jewish scholars, who served as intermediaries between Islamic and Christian intellectual worlds. Each translation was an act of both preservation and transformation, maintaining the essential insights while adapting them to new linguistic and cultural contexts. But here too, the spectre of loss haunted every achievement. The sophistication of Islamic science and philosophy in medieval Spain existed in constant tension with religious and political forces that viewed such pursuits with suspicion. The works of Ibn Rushd, known in Latin as Averroes, which represented some of the most advanced thinking about the relationship between reason and faith, between Aristotelian philosophy and religious doctrine, were being banned and burned by religious authorities even as they were being eagerly studied by Christian theologians in Paris and Oxford. The knowledge was surviving, but in fragments, in translations of translations, in partial copies that preserved some insights while losing others. The original context that had given birth to these ideas, the intellectual environment that had nurtured their development, was being destroyed, even as the ideas themselves found new homes in distant lands. Future scholars would have access to the conclusions without understanding the processes, to the results without seeing the reasoning that had led to them. The language of stones, in the high plateau of Bolivia, among the ruins of Tiwanaku, another kind of knowledge was becoming incomprehensible to those who lived in its shadow. The massive stone structures that had once formed the ceremonial heart of a pre-Columbian empire continued to stand, their precisely fitted blocks defying time and weather, but the understanding of their purpose, their astronomical alignments, their role in the complex religious and social life of their builders, was fading with each generation that passed after the culture's mysterious collapse. The Aymara people who lived among these ruins maintained fragmentary memories, stories that hinted at the monument's significance but could no longer fully explain their meaning. They knew that their ancestors had been capable of extraordinary feats of engineering and astronomical observation, but the specific knowledge of how these achievements had been accomplished was lost. The language of the stones, encoded in their positions and proportions, had become as foreign as any dead tongue. This was perhaps the most poignant form of lost knowledge. Not the dramatic destruction of libraries or the burning of texts, but the gradual forgetting that occurs when the cultural context that gives meaning to achievements disappears. The stones of Tiwanaku were perfectly preserved, their astronomical alignments as precise as the day they were set in place, but without the framework of understanding that had originally interpreted these alignments, they might as well have been random arrangements of rock. The same forgetting was occurring throughout the Americas as European contact disrupted indigenous cultures across 2 continents. The sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics demonstrated by Maya monuments was becoming incomprehensible, even to the descendants of those who had built them. The codices that had recorded this knowledge were being systematically destroyed by Spanish missionaries who saw them as works of the devil. But even those that survived in hidden caches were gradually becoming unreadable as the knowledge of Maya hieroglyphic writing died out. The loss was not merely of information, but of entire ways of thinking about the world. The Maya understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear, their complex mathematical concepts that included the use of zero long before it was known in Europe, their detailed observations of planetary movements and their ability to predict eclipses centuries in advance. All of this represented not just accumulated data, but fundamentally different approaches to understanding reality. When the last priest astronomers who could read the ancient codices died without passing on their knowledge, entire intellectual traditions vanished. Future scholars would be able to recognize the sophistication of Maya achievements by studying their architectural remains and their surviving calendar calculations, but they would be locked out of the conceptual frameworks that had made these achievements possible. They would see the results but not understand the reasoning, admire the precision but miss the underlying philosophy. In the mountains of Peru, similar losses were occurring among the Inca, whose empire had achieved administrative and engineering, feats that seemed almost impossible without written records. The quipu system of knotted strings that served as their information storage technology was becoming incomprehensible as the trained interpreters who could read the complex patterns of knots and colors died or were killed during the Spanish conquest. The irony was that the Spanish, for all their documentation of other aspects of Inca culture, never properly learned to read quipu. They recognized that these knotted strings contained important information, population records, tribute accounts, perhaps even historical narratives. But they relied on native interpreters to translate the contents. When these interpreters were gone, the quipu became mere curiosities, their information as inaccessible as if it had been written in a completely unknown script. Modern scholars, working with the few surviving quipu and the fragmentary Spanish, accounts of their contents have been able to decipher some of the numerical information they contain, but the narrative possibilities remain largely mysterious. Did the Inca record their history in knotted strings? Were there epic poems and religious texts encoded in these portable archives? The potential richness of what was lost can only be imagined. The destruction of the Inca road system represented another kind of lost knowledge, not information, recorded in books or quipu, but the accumulated understanding embedded in infrastructure. The roads themselves, with their precisely engineered switchbacks and suspension bridges, their way stations and storage facilities, represented centuries of learning about high-altitude construction, about the logistics of governing a far-flung empire, about the integration of diverse ecological zones into a single economic system. When the Spanish conquest disrupted the social organization that maintained these roads, the knowledge of how to build and repair them began to disappear. The techniques for constructing suspension bridges that could span deep mountain gorges, for building retaining walls that could last for centuries in earthquake-prone regions, for organizing the labor systems that kept thousands of miles of mountain paths in constant repair. All of this was lost, along with the empire that had created it. The silence of scholars. In the great library of Baghdad, the house of wisdom that had once been the intellectual center of the Islamic world, a different kind of ending was approaching. The scholars who had made this institution famous, the mathematicians who had developed algebra, the astronomers who had mapped the movements of planets, the philosophers who had synthesized Greek thought with Islamic theology, were growing old, and fewer students were coming to replace them. The Mongol invasion of 1258 would provide a dramatic punctuation to this decline, with the famous story of the Tigris River running black with ink from the destroyed manuscripts. But the real loss of knowledge had begun decades earlier as political. Instability and religious conservatism combined to make the pursuit of learning increasingly difficult and dangerous. The scholars themselves could sense the change in the intellectual climate. Abu Nasr al-Farabi, known as the second teacher after Aristotle, had died in 950, and his philosophical works were already being viewed with suspicion by religious authorities who saw in them dangerous innovations that threatened orthodox belief. The mathematical treatises that had revolutionized understanding of geometry and algebra were being copied less frequently, not because they were unimportant, but because there were fewer scholars capable of understanding and building upon them. The translation movement that had brought Greek and Indian learning into Arabic was grinding to a halt, not from lack of source material, but from lack of interest and support. The patrons who had once competed to fund scholarly projects were increasingly focused on military campaigns and religious construction. The intellectual curiosity that had driven earlier generations of Muslim scholars to seek out knowledge wherever it could be found was being replaced by a more inward-looking focus on textual commentary and religious lore. When the Mongols finally arrived at Baghdad's gates, they were destroying not just a library, but an entire intellectual tradition that had already been weakening from within. The manuscripts that burned represented not only the accumulated learning of centuries, but also the methodological approaches, the habits of mind, the institutional structures that had made possible the Islamic golden age of learning. The immediate, physical destruction was devastating enough, thousands of years of accumulated human knowledge literally going up in smoke. But the longer-term loss was perhaps even more significant. The networks of scholars that had connected Baghdad to Cairo, to Cordoba, to Samarkand were broken. The systems of patronage that had supported research and translation were destroyed. The schools and universities that had trained new generations of thinkers were closed or abandoned. Some knowledge survived in copies that had been made in other centers of learning, but the living tradition that had connected this knowledge to ongoing research and development was largely lost. Future scholars would have access to many of the texts that had been produced during the Islamic Golden Age, but they would lack the intellectual communities and institutional support that had made possible the original flowering of this learning. In the universities of medieval Europe, a more gradual process of forgetting was occurring. The cathedral schools and early universities had preserved and transmitted classical learning through the dark centuries following the fall of Rome. But they had also transformed this knowledge in ways that sometimes obscured its original meaning and context. Aristotelian natural philosophy, filtered through multiple translations and adapted to fit Christian theology, retained its logical structure, but lost much of its original empirical foundation. The careful observations of natural phenomena that had supported Aristotle's conclusions were often unknown to medieval scholars who worked primarily with abstract logical arguments derived from his texts. This created a curious situation where scholars possessed sophisticated intellectual tools, but lacked the methodological approaches that had originally created the knowledge they were manipulating. They could engage in elaborate logical disputes about the number of angels that could dance on the head of a pin, but they had largely forgotten how to use observation and experimentation to test their theories against reality. The mathematical knowledge preserved in universities was similarly abstracted from its practical applications. Euclidean geometry was taught as an exercise in logical reasoning, but the engineering and architectural applications that had originally motivated its development were often ignored or forgotten. Students learned to prove theorems, but not to use mathematical thinking to solve real-world problems. This situation would persist for centuries, creating educated elites who were highly trained in abstract reasoning, but largely cut off from the practical and empirical traditions that had originally given their knowledge its power and relevance. The recovery of this more complete approach to learning would require not just the rediscovery of ancient texts, but the reconstruction of entire ways of thinking about the relationship between theory and practice, between abstract knowledge and lived experience. The memory of water. In the terraced mountainsides of the Philippines, among the rice paddies that had fed generations of Ifugao farmers, another form of knowledge was slowly disappearing. The intricate understanding of water management, of soil conservation, of crop rotation that had allowed these communities to transform steep mountain slopes into productive agricultural land was being lost as younger generations moved to cities and adopted different ways of life. The terraces themselves remained, carved into the mountainsides like giant staircases reaching toward the clouds, but the knowledge of how to maintain them, how to manage the complex irrigation systems that fed them, how to coordinate the planting and harvesting schedules that kept the entire system in balance, was fading with each elder who died without finding someone willing to learn the old ways. This was not the dramatic destruction of a library or the burning of manuscripts, but the quiet disappearance of knowledge that had never been written down because it had never needed to be. For 2,000 years, this understanding had been passed from parent to child, from neighbor to neighbor, through direct participation in the work itself. The knowledge was embedded in the landscape, encoded in the timing of seasonal activities, preserved in the collective memory of the community. But collective memory requires community, and the communities that had maintained these agricultural systems were being transformed by economic forces that made traditional farming less attractive than wage labor in distant cities. The young people who might have learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when to flood or drain the paddies, when to transplant seedlings, when to repair the earthen dikes that held back the mountain streams, were instead learning to read computers and factory schedules. The loss was not merely of agricultural technique, but of an entire way of understanding the relationship between human communities and natural systems. The Ifugao terraces represented not just engineering skill, but a philosophical approach that saw human activity as part of larger ecological cycles, that understood prosperity as something that emerged from careful attention to the needs of soil and water and plants rather than from the extraction and exploitation of natural resources. The social organizations that had made possible the coordination of terrace maintenance, the complex systems of collective labor, the traditional forms of conflict resolution that kept irrigation disputes from destroying the cooperation essential to the system's survival, the religious practices that sanctified the agricultural calendar and gave cosmic significance to the mundane work of farming. All of this was being lost along with the technical knowledge. When the last farmers who understood the traditional timing of water release from the mountain reservoirs died or moved away, the entire system would become vulnerable to disruption. Future generations might admire the terraces as an archaeological wonder, might even attempt to restore them as a tourist attraction, but they would lack the living knowledge that had originally created and sustained them. Similar losses were occurring in farming communities around the world as traditional agricultural knowledge gave way to industrial methods that promised higher yields and greater efficiency. But that often came at the cost of sustainability and ecological understanding. The knowledge of how to breed seeds for local conditions, how to maintain soil fertility without chemical inputs, how to read weather patterns and adjust farming practices accordingly. All of this was being replaced by standardized techniques that worked well in the short term, but that lacked the deep ecological understanding that had allowed traditional agriculture to sustain communities for millennia. In the Amazon rainforest, Indigenous communities were losing their encyclopedic knowledge of medicinal plants as Western medicine offered seemingly superior alternatives to traditional healing practices. Shamans, who could identify hundreds of different species and knew the specific preparations and combinations that made them effective for various ailments, were finding no successors willing to spend the decades required to master this knowledge. The loss was particularly tragic because modern pharmacological research was beginning to validate many traditional remedies, discovering that indigenous healers had identified chemical compounds that could treat everything from heart disease to cancer. But by the time Western science was ready to learn from traditional knowledge, much of it was already disappearing. The healers, who might have served as bridges between traditional and modern understanding, were dying without passing on their knowledge to communities that had lost faith in the old ways. The irony was that the very success of modern medicine in treating acute conditions was undermining the traditional knowledge that might have contributed to understanding chronic diseases and preventive care. Indigenous healing practices often emphasized maintaining health through lifestyle and diet rather than treating disease after it had already developed. But this approach seemed less impressive than antibiotics that could cure infections or surgery that could save lives in emergency situations. Yet traditional healing knowledge often included understandings of plant chemistry and human physiology that had taken centuries to develop and that could not be quickly reconstructed once lost. The knowledge of which plants to harvest at what times of year, how to prepare them to maximize their therapeutic properties, how to combine different substances to create more effective treatments while minimizing side effects. All of this represented a form of pharmacological sophistication that had been developed through careful observation and experimentation over many generations. When this knowledge disappeared, it was often lost forever. Unlike written texts that could be rediscovered and retranslated, unlike archaeological sites that could be excavated and studied, the knowledge held in human memory and transmitted through apprenticeship vanished completely when the last practitioners died without finding successors. The plants themselves might survive in the forest. The chemical compounds that made them effective might remain unchanged, but the knowledge of how to use them safely and effectively would be gone. Future researchers might be able to analyze the chemical composition of traditional remedies and even synthesize their active ingredients, but they would lack the accumulated wisdom about dosages, about interactions, about the subtle arts of diagnosis and treatment that had made traditional healing systems effective. The last calculations in the observatories of Maya cities, as the classical period drew to its close, astronomers continued their patient work of tracking planetary movements and calculating calendar correlations. But they were doing so in increasingly isolated communities as the political and social structures that had supported their work collapsed around them. The long count calendar, that extraordinary intellectual achievement that had allowed Maya mathematicians to calculate dates spanning millions of years, continued to function perfectly, but fewer and fewer people understood its underlying principles or cared about its precision. The knowledge of how to correlate the complex interlocking cycles of the Maya calendar system, how to predict eclipses decades in advance, how to time agricultural and ceremonial activities to celestial events, was becoming the province of a dwindling group of specialist priest astronomers. These scholars could see their civilization fragmenting, their cities being abandoned, their carefully maintained astronomical records falling into neglect, but they continued their calculations, as if the work itself had value independent of its social context. In the final centuries of the classical period, Maya astronomical knowledge reached new heights of sophistication even as the culture that had produced it was disintegrating. The Venus tables of Copan, which tracked the movements of that planet, with extraordinary accuracy, were completed just as the city was being abandoned. The astronomical alignments built into the latest construction at Chichen Itza were precisely calculated, even though the social organization needed to maintain such complex building projects was already breaking down. This created a poignant situation where the highest intellectual achievements of Maya civilization were being completed just as the civilization itself was disappearing. The knowledge was reaching its fullest development at exactly the moment when there would be no one left to appreciate or build upon it. The codices that contained the most sophisticated astronomical calculations were written in the post-classical period, when Maya political power had already fragmented and when the great ceremonial centers were no longer functioning as they had during the height of the civilization. The scholars who produced these texts were working in a cultural context that could no longer fully support or utilize their knowledge, creating intellectual masterpieces for a civilization that was already becoming a memory. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they found Maya communities that still possessed fragments of the ancient learning, but that could no longer fully interpret their own astronomical traditions. The knowledge survived in partial form, in calendar-keeping practices and agricultural timing, but the theoretical framework that had originally supported these applications was largely forgotten. The Spanish missionaries, convinced that Maya texts were works of the devil, systematically destroyed the codices that contained the most complete record of this astronomical knowledge. Diego de Landa, the bishop who ordered the burning of Maya books at Mani in 1562, later attempted to record Maya calendar knowledge when he realized its sophistication. But by then, much of the expertise needed to explain the system had already been lost. Only 4 Maya codices survive today, and these preserve just fragments of what was once a vast literature of astronomical and mathematical knowledge. Modern scholars, working with these fragmentary texts and with archaeological evidence from Maya sites, have been able to reconstruct some aspects of Maya scientific achievement, but they remain locked out of the full complexity of Maya intellectual culture. The situation was similar in other parts of Mesoamerica, where the astronomical knowledge of the Zapotecs and the mathematical innovations of the Olmecs disappeared along with the civilizations that had created them. The observatory at Monte Alban, with its precise stellar alignments, fell into ruin as Zapotec political power declined. The sophisticated calendar systems developed by earlier cultures were forgotten or simplified as new groups took control of their territories. In each case, the loss was not simply of information, but of entire approaches to understanding the relationship between human activity and cosmic cycles. Mesoamerican astronomers had developed ways of thinking about time and space that were fundamentally different from European approaches, but these alternative conceptual frameworks disappeared along with the cultures that had sustained them. The knowledge that was lost included not just specific observations and calculations, but entire methodologies for conducting astronomical research without telescopes, for maintaining accurate calendars without mechanical clocks, for coordinating complex ceremonial and agricultural activities across vast regions without written communication systems. These methodological innovations might have contributed to global scientific knowledge if they had survived and if there had been opportunities for intellectual exchange between Mesoamerican and Old World scholars. Instead, they vanish so completely that modern astronomers working with similar observational limitations have had to rediscover some of the techniques that Maya astronomers had perfected 1,000 years earlier. The Maya understanding of Venus cycles was more accurate than European calculations made with superior instruments. Their eclipse prediction methods were more reliable than those used in medieval European universities. Their calendar system was more precise than the Julian calendar that was still being used in Europe when Spanish conquistadors first encountered Maya cities. Yet none of this knowledge survived in a form that could contribute to the development of modern astronomy. The intellectual achievements of Maya science disappeared as completely as if they had never existed, leaving only tantalizing hints in surviving architectural alignments and fragmentary texts that modern scholars are still struggling to fully understand. The story of these lost achievements raises profound questions about the nature of knowledge and its preservation. How much human intellectual accomplishment has disappeared simply because it was developed in isolation from the mainstream traditions that have survived to influence modern thought? How many alternative approaches to understanding the natural world have been lost along with the cultures that created them? The Maya case suggests that the loss of knowledge is not always the result of dramatic destruction, but can occur through the gradual breakdown of the social and cultural contexts that give meaning and purpose to intellectual work. Knowledge requires not just preservation, but active transmission and application. When the communities that understood and used complex intellectual traditions disappeared, the knowledge itself became meaningless, even if the physical records survived. The knowledge accumulated in these hidden chambers represented something far more profound than mere scholarship. It was the crystallization of human consciousness itself, the distilled essence of what it meant to observe, to question, to seek meaning in the vast expanse of existence. Each scroll, each tablet, each carefully preserved fragment contained not just information, but the living breath of minds that had grappled with the fundamental mysteries of their time. In the deepest vaults of the Library of Pergamon, beneath layers of bureaucratic records and official histories, lay collections that challenged the very foundations of what scholars believed about the ancient world. Here, wrapped in silk that had somehow retained its lustrous quality through the centuries, were accounts of mathematical discoveries that would not be officially made until the Renaissance. Geometric proofs that revealed an understanding of space and dimension that seemed to anticipate concepts modern science would struggle to rediscover. The margins of these mathematical texts bore notes in multiple hands, evidence of a scholarly tradition that had persisted in secret long after the official academies had closed their doors. These marginalia revealed debates that had continued for generations, questions passed down like sacred mysteries from teacher to student, each contributing their own insights to problems that seemed to transcend their historical moment. One particularly remarkable manuscript contained what appeared to be astronomical observations recorded over a period of several centuries. The handwriting changed, the language evolved from classical Greek to Byzantine Greek to medieval Latin, yet the observations continued with mathematical precision. Star charts mapped movements across the heavens with an accuracy that suggested these watchers possessed instruments and techniques that had been lost to the broader world. These astronomical records painted a picture of a civilization that had never truly ended, but had instead retreated into shadows, maintaining its traditions and expanding its knowledge while the world around it forgot the very existence of such learning. The Star Watchers had tracked comets across multiple appearances, had calculated the movements of planets with precision that rivaled modern ephemeris tables, had even noted what appeared to be observations of stellar phenomena that would not be officially discovered until the age of telescopes. But perhaps most intriguing were the texts that dealt with what the scribes called the architecture of memory. These were not merely philosophical treatises, but practical guides to techniques for preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. They described elaborate systems of mental palaces, methods for encoding information in seemingly innocuous songs and stories, techniques for hiding profound wisdom in the apparent simplicity of folk tales and children's games. The practitioners of these memory arts had understood something that modern civilization was only beginning to rediscover: that knowledge without context becomes mere data, and data without wisdom becomes noise. They had developed methods for preserving not just facts, but the deep understanding that gave those facts meaning. Their techniques ensured that future generations would not merely inherit information, but would receive the capacity to generate new insights from that inheritance. Reading these memory texts was like discovering the secret history of human consciousness itself. The authors described techniques for achieving states of heightened awareness, methods for accessing what they called the deep wells of knowing that lay beneath the surface of ordinary thought. They wrote of meditation practices that could induce visions of mathematical truths, of contemplative exercises that revealed the hidden patterns underlying natural phenomena. These were not the mystical ravings of untutored minds, but the carefully documented experiences of highly trained scholars who had pushed the boundaries of human cognition to their very limits. They had discovered techniques for thinking that modern psychology was only beginning to understand, methods for accessing creative insights that bridged the gap between rational analysis and intuitive leaps. The more archaeologists and scholars studied these hidden collections, the more they realized that what they had discovered was not simply a library, but the remnants of an entire parallel tradition of learning that had persisted alongside, but separate from, the official channels of knowledge transmission. This Shadow Academy had maintained its own methods, its own standards, its own understanding of what knowledge was truly worth preserving. The practitioners of this hidden tradition had been remarkably selective in what they chose to preserve. While official libraries had filled their shelves with the political chronicles and religious commentaries that satisfied contemporary authorities, these secret scholars had focused on texts that revealed fundamental principles, universal patterns, timeless insights that would remain relevant regardless of changing political circumstances. They had been students of the eternal in human experience, seekers of those truths that transcended the particular concerns of any single era. Their collections reflected a profound understanding that most of what passes for important knowledge in any given age is merely fashion, while the truly valuable insights are often overlooked precisely because they seem too simple, too obvious, too removed from the pressing concerns of the moment. This selectivity extended to their methods of preservation as well. Rather than simply copying texts verbatim, they had developed techniques for distilling essential insights into increasingly concentrated forms. Like alchemists working with base metals, they had learned to extract the pure gold of understanding from the dross of cultural accident and historical contingency. Their most condensed texts were marvels of intellectual compression, single pages that contained insights that less skilled scribes would have expanded into entire volumes. These concentrated wisdom texts required readers who had been trained in the appropriate methods of interpretation. But for those who possessed the necessary keys, they offered access to understanding that was both profound and immediately practical. The training methods described in these texts revealed an approach to education that was radically different from both ancient and modern norms. Rather than focusing on the accumulation of information, these hidden academies had concentrated on developing what they called the capacities of understanding. Students were trained not merely to memorize and repeat, but to recognize patterns, to see connections, to generate new insights from fundamental principles. The curriculum described in these educational texts was breathtakingly comprehensive, yet focused on developing specific cognitive abilities rather than covering predetermined subject matter. Students learned mathematics not merely as a collection of techniques, but as a language for discovering the hidden structures that underlie all phenomena. They studied astronomy not just to predict celestial events, but to develop what the texts called the long perspective that could perceive patterns across vast scales of time and space. History, in this hidden curriculum, was taught not as a sequence of events to be memorized, but as a laboratory for understanding the recurring patterns in human behavior. Students learned to recognize the deep structures that appeared again and again across different cultures and time periods, to see through the surface differences that obscured fundamental similarities in how human societies developed, flourished, and declined. The biological and medical texts revealed a similar approach to understanding life itself. Rather than simply cataloguing symptoms and treatments, these hidden scholars had sought to understand the underlying principles that governed health and disease. Their medical texts described the human body not as a collection of separate systems, but as a unified field of energy and information that could be influenced through understanding its fundamental patterns. Their approach to healing emphasized the restoration of natural balance rather than the suppression of symptoms. They had developed diagnostic techniques that assessed not just physical conditions, but the overall harmony of what they called the life field that animated each individual. Their treatments focused on removing obstructions to the natural, healing processes, rather than forcing the body into predetermined states. The pharmacological knowledge preserved in these texts was particularly remarkable, revealing an understanding of plant medicines that seemed to anticipate modern discoveries in biochemistry. But more than simply knowing which plants could treat which conditions, these hidden healers had understood the subtle energetic properties of their medicines, the ways in which different preparations could influence not just physical symptoms, but emotional and mental states as well. Their psychological insights were perhaps even more advanced than their medical knowledge. The texts described techniques for working with what they called the deep mind, methods for accessing and transforming unconscious patterns that influence behavior and perception. They had developed practices for healing not just individual, psychological wounds, but the collective trauma that accumulated across generations. These psychological texts revealed an understanding of human nature that was both more optimistic and more realistic than most contemporary approaches. They recognized the profound capacity for growth and transformation that existed within every individual, while also acknowledging the powerful unconscious forces that could keep people trapped in destructive patterns. Their therapeutic methods aimed to awaken what they called the inner teacher that could guide individuals toward greater wholeness and effectiveness. The social and political texts in these hidden collections offered equally profound insights into the dynamics of human groups. These scholars had studied the rise and fall of civilizations, not as historians seeking to record events, but as scientists investigating the natural laws that govern collective human behavior. They had identified recurring patterns in how societies formed, developed, achieved stability, and eventually declined. Their political analyses focused not on the personalities and ambitions of individual leaders, but on the underlying conditions that determined whether leadership would be effective or destructive. They had developed sophisticated models for understanding how information flowed through social systems, how decisions were made and implemented, how power could be exercised in ways that enhanced rather than diminished collective well-being. These political texts revealed a remarkable understanding of what modern theorists would call systems thinking. The hidden scholars had recognized that political problems could rarely be solved through direct intervention, but required understanding and working with the complex networks of relationships and feedback loops that characterized all social systems. They had developed strategies for creating positive change that worked with, rather than against, the natural dynamics of human groups. Their economic analyses were equally sophisticated, revealing an understanding of wealth and exchange that transcended the particular monetary systems of their time. They had identified the fundamental principles that determined whether economic systems would promote widespread prosperity or concentrate wealth in the hands of a few. Their texts described methods for creating economic structures that aligned individual incentives with collective well-being. But perhaps most remarkably, these hidden scholars had understood that all their various fields of study were ultimately aspects of a single, integrated understanding of how consciousness and matter interacted to create the phenomenal world. Their deepest texts revealed a unified theory that connected mathematical principles, astronomical patterns, biological processes, psychological dynamics, and social phenomena into a coherent whole. This unified understanding was not merely theoretical, but intensely practical. The texts described techniques for applying these fundamental principles to solve problems in any domain, methods for recognizing when apparently different challenges were actually variations on the same underlying pattern. They had developed what they called the art of principled action that allowed practitioners to work effectively in any field by understanding the deep structures that governed all manifestation. The more scholars studied these integrated texts, the more they realized that what they had discovered was not simply an ancient library, but evidence of a level of human development that had been achieved and then lost. These hidden practitioners had not merely accumulated knowledge, but had developed capacities of consciousness that allowed them to perceive reality more directly and completely than most human beings before or since. Their texts described states of awareness in which the boundaries between observer and observed became permeable, allowing for types of understanding that transcended the limitations of purely analytical thinking. They had developed techniques for accessing what they called direct knowing, forms of perception that could grasp complex patterns immediately, rather than building understanding piece by piece through logical analysis. These enhanced capacities of perception had allowed them to see connections and patterns that remained invisible to ordinary consciousness. They could perceive the subtle currents of influence that flowed between apparently separate phenomena, the hidden threads of causation that connected events across vast distances in space and time. Their understanding was holistic in the deepest sense, recognizing the fundamental interconnectedness of all existence, while still being able to work effectively with the apparent separations that characterized ordinary experience. The preservation of these capacities had required not just individual development, but the creation of supportive community structures that could maintain such elevated states across generations. The texts described elaborate systems of mutual support and collective practice that allowed groups of practitioners to sustain levels of awareness that would have been impossible for isolated individuals to maintain. These communities had developed sophisticated methods for selecting and training new members, ensuring that the transmission of their knowledge would continue unbroken even as external conditions changed. They had created institutions that were flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the essential core of their tradition. Their organizational structures reflected the same understanding of natural principles that informed all their other activities. The governance of these hidden communities was based on what the text called the principle of resonant authority, a system in which leadership naturally flowed to those individuals who most fully embodied the capacities that the community was seeking to develop. Authority was not imposed from above or seized through force, but emerged organically from the recognition of genuine wisdom and capability. These communities had developed economic systems that supported their educational and research activities without compromising their values or principles. They had learned to create wealth through the application of their enhanced understanding, rather than through exploitation of others or depletion of natural resources. Their economic activities were integrated with their spiritual and intellectual development, creating abundance that enriched both individual members and the surrounding society. The more archaeologists studied the remains of these communities, the more evidence they found of their remarkable success in creating sustainable ways of life. The sites associated with these hidden scholars showed evidence of agricultural techniques that had maintained soil fertility for centuries, building methods that had created structures of extraordinary durability and beauty, craft traditions that had produced goods of unmatched quality and elegance. These communities had apparently solved many of the practical problems that continued to challenge conventional civilization. They had developed methods for managing waste that turned all byproducts into resources for other processes. Their energy systems had been based on renewable sources that they had learned to harness with remarkable efficiency. Their transportation methods had been both more effective and less environmentally destructive than the technologies that replaced them. But perhaps most importantly, they had created social structures that successfully balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility. Their texts described governance systems that encouraged personal development and creative expression while maintaining the social cohesion necessary for complex cooperative projects. They had solved the ancient tension between individual rights and social obligations through developing what they called enlightened self-interest, a perspective that recognized the fundamental interdependence of personal and collective well-being. The decline of these remarkable communities appeared to have been gradual rather than sudden, the result of changing external conditions that made their way of life increasingly difficult to maintain. As conventional civilizations grew more powerful and aggressive, the peaceful, open societies created by the hidden scholars became vulnerable to conquest and disruption. The very qualities that had made their communities internally successful, openness, trust, cooperation, became liabilities in a world increasingly dominated by competition and conflict. Some of the latest texts in the collections describe the difficult decisions faced by these communities as external pressures mounted. Some groups had chosen to go deeper underground, creating even more hidden centers of learning that could survive periods of chaos and destruction. Others had decided to disperse their knowledge as widely as possible, encoding their insights in forms that could be preserved and transmitted even if their institutions were destroyed. The most poignant texts were those that described the deliberate concealment of knowledge that these scholars had spent lifetimes developing, recognizing that their understanding could be misused by those who lacked the ethical development to handle it responsibly. They had created elaborate systems for hiding their most important discoveries. They had embedded profound insights in apparently simple stories, had disguised advanced techniques as primitive folk practices, had scattered the pieces of their most powerful knowledge across multiple traditions to prevent any single group from gaining access to the complete systems. This intentional concealment explained much about the frustrating gaps and inconsistencies that scholars had long noticed in ancient texts. What had appeared to be primitive superstition or incomplete understanding was often sophisticated knowledge that had been deliberately obscured to protect it from misuse. The apparent contradictions in ancient sources were frequently the result of viewing fragments of larger systems that had been intentionally separated to prevent reconstruction by unauthorized individuals. The rediscovery of these hidden traditions raised profound questions about the relationship between knowledge and responsibility. The texts made clear that their authors had believed that advanced understanding carried corresponding obligations, that the development of enhanced capabilities was meaningless unless accompanied by the wisdom to use those capabilities in service of the greater good. This perspective challenged many assumptions about progress and development that had guided conventional civilization. The hidden scholars had apparently believed that technical advancement without corresponding growth in consciousness was not only useless, but actively dangerous. They had prioritized the development of wisdom over the accumulation of power, understanding over control, harmony over dominance. Their approach to knowledge had been fundamentally different from both ancient and modern norms. Rather than viewing information as a commodity to be accumulated and hoarded, they had understood knowledge as a living force that needed to flow freely to maintain its vitality. They had created systems for sharing understanding that enhanced, rather than diminished, the knowledge of those who gave it away. This perspective had led them to develop entirely different criteria for evaluating the worth of ideas and discoveries. Rather than measuring value in terms of practical utility or theoretical elegance, they had assessed knowledge based on its capacity to promote what they called the flourishing of consciousness. They had been interested not in what could be done, but in what should be done, not in what was possible, but in what was wise. The text revealed that these hidden scholars had possessed technologies and capabilities that could have revolutionized their civilizations, but had chosen not to deploy them because they recognized that their societies lacked the wisdom to use such powers responsibly. They had developed forms of energy generation that could have eliminated scarcity, communication systems that could have connected distant cultures, healing techniques that could have extended human life far beyond its normal limits. Yet, they had kept these discoveries hidden, sharing them only within their own carefully selected communities, where they could be used in accordance with ethical principles that prioritized the well-being of all life. They had understood that power without wisdom was corruption, that capability without responsibility was destruction, that knowledge without love was merely sophisticated ignorance. This recognition had led them to focus their energies on developing the inner capacities that could guide the wise use of external technologies. They had understood that the fundamental problems facing human civilization were not technical, but psychological, not material, but spiritual. The solutions they had sought were not better methods for manipulating the external world, but enhanced capacities for understanding and working with the deeper patterns that governed all manifestation. Their research had been directed toward developing what they called technologies of consciousness, methods for enhancing human awareness and capability that worked from the inside out rather than the outside in. They had discovered techniques for accessing higher states of consciousness that provided direct insight into the fundamental nature of reality. They had developed practices for integrating these insights into daily life in ways that transformed both individual experience and collective interaction. The evidence suggested that these inner technologies had been remarkably effective. The communities that had mastered them had apparently achieved levels of individual fulfillment and collective harmony that remained unmatched in recorded history. Their members had lived longer, healthier, more creative lives than their contemporaries. Their societies had been characterized by levels of cooperation, innovation, and genuine prosperity that seemed almost mythical to later observers. Yet all of this had been achieved without the environmental destruction, social inequality, or psychological alienation that had characterized most subsequent civilizations. These hidden communities had somehow managed to create abundance without exploitation, progress without pollution, individual development without social fragmentation. The secrets of their success lay in their understanding of what they called the technology of alignment, methods for ensuring that individual actions and collective policies remained in harmony with natural principles. They had developed techniques for sensing when proposed actions would create beneficial or harmful consequences across multiple levels of manifestation. Their decision-making processes had incorporated assessment criteria that took into account not just immediate effects, but long-term implications for both human society and the larger web of life. This capacity for sensing alignment had been developed through practices that enhanced what the texts called the wisdom of the heart, a form of intelligence that could perceive the deeper significance of events and choices. This was not merely emotional intelligence, but a more fundamental capacity for recognizing the patterns of harmony and disharmony that governed all natural systems. The development of this heart-based wisdom had been considered the foundation of all other learning in these hidden traditions. Students began their education not with academic subjects, but with practices designed to awaken and refine their capacity for sensing the deeper currents of truth and goodness that flowed through all experience. Only after this foundation had been established were they introduced to more specialized fields of study. This approach had produced individuals who possessed not just knowledge, but wisdom, not just capability, but judgment, not just intelligence, but understanding. These practitioners had been able to navigate complex challenges with an intuitive sense of right action that transcended purely rational analysis. They had developed what the texts called the art of spontaneous wisdom, the ability to recognize appropriate responses to novel situations without lengthy deliberation. As scholars continued to study these remarkable texts, they began to realize that what they had discovered was more than just historical artifacts. These were living transmissions from a level of human development that remained as relevant and necessary today as it had been in ancient times. The challenges facing modern civilization were not fundamentally different from those that had confronted these hidden communities: how to create sustainable abundance, how to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility, how to develop and use power wisely. The insights preserved in these texts offered practical guidance for addressing contemporary problems that seemed intractable from conventional perspectives. Their approaches to education, governance, economics, healing, and environmental stewardship provided tested alternatives to methods that were clearly failing to create the levels of well-being and sustainability that human civilization needed to survive and thrive. But accessing this guidance required more than simply reading the texts. The knowledge they contained was designed to be activated through practice, to be understood through application rather than mere study. The hidden scholars had embedded their insights in forms that could only be fully grasped by those who were willing to undertake the inner development necessary to embody their understanding. This meant that the rediscovery of these traditions was not simply an academic exercise, but a call to action. The texts themselves made clear that their preservation had been intended not just to satisfy historical curiosity, but to provide resources for future generations who might find themselves facing similar challenges. The hidden scholars had, apparently, foreseen that their insights would eventually be needed again, and had created multiple methods for ensuring that their knowledge would survive until that time arrived. The evidence suggested that many of these preservation methods were still active, that the transmission of this hidden wisdom had continued unbroken, even as its institutional forms had disappeared. Scattered around the world, in traditions that appeared to have no connection to each other, researchers were finding fragments of the same essential understanding that had characterized these ancient communities. Folk practices that had been dismissed as primitive superstition were revealing themselves to be sophisticated techniques for working with subtle energies. Traditional healing methods that had been marginalized by modern medicine were demonstrating effectiveness that could only be explained by understanding the deeper principles that the hidden scholars had mastered. Indigenous knowledge systems that had been preserved in oral traditions were found to contain insights that paralleled the most advanced concepts discovered in the ancient texts. This global pattern of preservation suggested that the decline of the hidden communities had not meant the complete loss of their understanding. Instead, their knowledge had been dispersed and disguised, woven into the fabric of human culture, in forms that could survive periods of darkness and ignorance. Like seeds scattered by a dying plant, fragments of their wisdom had taken root in traditions that could maintain them until conditions became favorable for their renewed flowering. The recognition of this pattern was itself part of the awakening that the texts had described. The hidden scholars had written about cycles of concealment and revelation, periods when their understanding would retreat into obscurity, followed by times when it would re-emerge in new forms appropriate to changed circumstances. They had apparently understood that knowledge, like all living systems, needed to undergo processes of death and rebirth to maintain its vitality across long periods of time. The current rediscovery of their traditions was occurring at a time when conventional approaches to human problems were clearly reaching their limits. Environmental destruction, social inequality, psychological alienation, and spiritual emptiness were creating conditions that demanded new responses based on deeper understanding. The timing of these discoveries seemed to confirm the hidden scholars' belief that their knowledge would become available precisely when it was most needed. But the re-emergence of this ancient wisdom was not happening in the form of restored institutions or recreated communities. Instead, it was manifesting as a new synthesis that combined the essential insights of the hidden traditions with the accumulated knowledge and changed conditions of modern times. The synthesis that was emerging was neither purely ancient nor completely contemporary, but represented an evolution that built upon both traditional wisdom and modern understanding. This evolutionary synthesis was being catalyzed by individuals who had somehow maintained or redeveloped the capacities that the hidden scholars had cultivated. These modern practitioners were finding ways to integrate ancient insights with contemporary knowledge, creating new approaches to education, healing, governance, and environmental stewardship that addressed current challenges while remaining true to timeless principles. The work of synthesis was not being done by any single group or institution, but was emerging spontaneously from the efforts of countless individuals who were independently rediscovering similar insights. Like the hidden communities of ancient times, these modern practitioners were often working in isolation or small groups, following their own inner guidance rather than external directives. Yet despite their geographical and cultural separation, these contemporary wisdom keepers were developing approaches that showed remarkable convergence. Their methods might differ in detail, but their fundamental understanding of human potential and social possibility was remarkably consistent. They were all working toward the same ultimate goal, the creation of human societies that could sustain both individual fulfillment and collective well-being across indefinite periods of time. The manuscripts discovered in the hidden libraries had provided crucial confirmation and guidance for these modern efforts. The texts had validated insights that contemporary practitioners had reached independently, while also offering tested methods for developing capacities that modern science was only beginning to understand. The ancient and contemporary streams of wisdom were reinforcing each other, creating a synthesis that was more powerful than either tradition alone. This synthesis was beginning to have practical effects in multiple domains. Educational experiments based on the principles discovered in the ancient texts were producing students with enhanced creativity, emotional intelligence, and problem-solving ability. Healing approaches that integrated traditional and modern understanding were achieving results that exceeded what either approach could accomplish independently. Organizational methods based on the governance principles found in the texts were creating more effective and humane institutions. Environmental restoration projects guided by the ecological insights preserved in the ancient libraries were demonstrating that it was possible to reverse damage that had been considered irreversible. Economic experiments based on the abundance principles described in the texts were creating prosperity that enhanced rather than depleted the systems that supported it. Social initiatives, inspired by the community-building methods found in the manuscripts, were healing divisions that had seemed intractable. These practical successes were creating ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate contexts. Each demonstration that alternative approaches could work was inspiring others to experiment with similar methods. Networks of communication were developing that allowed successful innovations to spread rapidly across geographical and cultural boundaries. A movement was emerging that sought to transform human civilization through the application of rediscovered wisdom rather than through the accumulation of additional power. The ancient texts had predicted this pattern of gradual transformation, describing how the seeds of new understanding would eventually grow into a forest that could provide shelter and nourishment for all life. They had written about a time when the hidden wisdom would no longer need to remain hidden, when humanity would have developed sufficient maturity to handle advanced knowledge responsibly. Whether that time had truly arrived remained to be seen. The texts made clear that the transition from a civilization based on power and competition to one based on wisdom and cooperation would not be automatic or effortless. It would require conscious choice and sustained effort from many individuals working across multiple generations. The rediscovery of ancient wisdom was only the beginning of a much longer process of transformation. But the signs were encouraging. The growing numbers of people who were seeking deeper meaning and purpose in their lives, the increasing recognition that conventional approaches to success were not creating genuine fulfillment, the widespread concern about environmental destruction and social inequality, all of these indicated that humanity was beginning to outgrow the consciousness that had created contemporary problems. The ancient wisdom keepers had written about such times of transition, describing them as periods of both great danger and unprecedented opportunity. They had understood that civilizations, like individuals, periodically reached points where they had to choose between evolution and dissolution. The challenges facing modern civilization represented such a choice point, a moment when humanity would determine its future direction through the collective sum of countless individual decisions. The knowledge preserved in the hidden libraries provided maps for navigating this transition successfully. The texts contained detailed descriptions of the stages through which consciousness evolved, the challenges that accompanied each stage, and the methods for transcending limitations that had trapped previous civilizations. They offered hope that humanity could learn from past mistakes rather than simply repeating them in new forms. But the texts also made clear that positive outcomes were not guaranteed. The evolution of consciousness required active participation from those who were capable of recognizing its necessity. The preservation and transmission of wisdom depended on individuals who were willing to undertake the inner development required, to embody and share their understanding. The transformation of civilization required leaders who could envision new possibilities and inspire others to work toward their realization. The hidden scholars had seen themselves as servants of this evolutionary process, guardians of potential, rather than wielders of power. Their primary concern had not been their own advancement, but the advancement of consciousness itself. They had worked tirelessly to create conditions that would support the development of wisdom in others, knowing that the ultimate success of their efforts would be measured not by their own achievements, but by the flourishing of future generations. This same spirit of service was emerging among contemporary practitioners who were working to integrate ancient wisdom with modern knowledge. They were motivated not by personal ambition, but by recognition of humanity's potential for transcending its current limitations. They were willing to work patiently and often invisibly, knowing that the most important changes occurred gradually and that visible results might not appear for many years. The manuscripts found in the hidden libraries had been addressed to such individuals, written for future generations who would find themselves called to participate in the great work of human transformation. The ancient authors had understood that their immediate audience might be small, but that their ultimate influence could be vast if their insights reached individuals who were prepared to act upon them. As scholars continued to translate and study these remarkable texts, they were discovering layer upon layer of meaning that revealed itself only gradually. The manuscripts had been written with multiple levels of significance, designed to offer appropriate guidance for readers at different stages of development. Surface meanings provided practical instruction for beginners, while deeper layers contained insights that could guide advanced practitioners for decades. This multi-layered structure meant that the texts would continue to yield new understanding as humanity's capacity for wisdom expanded. They were not static repositories of information, but living transmissions that could grow with their readers. The ancient authors had apparently understood that genuine wisdom could not be simply transferred from one mind to another, but had to be awakened through the interaction between prepared consciousness and skillfully crafted guidance. The discovery of these texts marked not an ending, but a beginning, not a conclusion, but an invitation. The hidden scholars had preserved their insights not to satisfy curiosity about the past, but to provide resources for creating a more enlightened future. Their knowledge was meant to be used, their methods were meant to be applied, their understanding was meant to be embodied and transmitted to new generations. In the end, the true test of their wisdom would not be how accurately scholars could interpret their texts, but how effectively contemporary practitioners could apply their insights to address current challenges. The hidden libraries had been discovered at a time when their contents were desperately needed. Whether humanity would have the wisdom to recognize this gift and the courage to act upon it would determine not just the fate of the ancient knowledge, but the future of human civilization itself. The manuscripts lay open now, their secrets revealed, to eyes that had waited centuries to read them. The knowledge they contained was available to anyone with the dedication to study them and the commitment to embody their insights. The choice of what to do with this rediscovered wisdom belonged to the present generation, just as the responsibility for its creation had belonged to the ancients who had preserved it with such care. In quiet libraries and research centers around the world, scholars worked by lamplight to unlock the remaining mysteries contained in texts that seemed to reveal new secrets with each reading. Their work was painstaking, requiring not just linguistic skill but the development of intuitive capacities that could perceive meanings that lay beyond mere words. They were becoming translators not just of ancient languages, but of an entirely different way of understanding reality. Meanwhile, in workshops and retreat centers, practitioners gathered to experiment with techniques that had been preserved for millennia in written form, but were now being embodied in living experience for the first time in generations. They were discovering that the ancient methods worked, that consciousness could indeed be developed, that wisdom could be cultivated, that human beings possess potentials that most civilizations had never even imagined. The convergence of scholarly, research and practical application was creating a renaissance of wisdom that drew from the deepest wells of human understanding while addressing the most pressing challenges of contemporary life. Ancient insights were being translated into modern applications. Timeless principles were being expressed in contemporary forms. Universal truths were being discovered anew by each generation that had the courage to seek them. As night settled over the libraries where these precious manuscripts were housed, the ancient wisdom seemed to whisper across the centuries, carrying messages from minds that had grappled with the eternal questions that still faced humanity. Their voices spoke not of what had been, but of what could be, not of achievements that lay in the past, but of possibilities that waited to be born. The texts had been preserved through dark ages and forgotten through golden ones, had survived the rise and fall of empires and the birth and death of languages. They had waited patiently for minds capable of understanding their significance and hearts willing to embrace their implications. Now that such minds and hearts had appeared, the ancient wisdom could complete its journey from concealment to revelation, from preservation to application, from potential to actuality. In the silence of those ancient libraries, where dust motes danced in shafts of light that illuminated pages covered with the careful script of long-dead scholars, the future was being written, not in new books, but in the consciousness of those who read the old ones, not in different words, but in the transformation of those who finally understood what the old words meant. The knowledge that had been hidden was hidden no longer. The wisdom that had been lost was being found. The understanding that had been preserved was finally being received by those for whom it had been intended. The long journey from past to future was nearing completion, and the ancient dream of human enlightenment was beginning to stir once more into wakefulness. Time itself seemed to bend in those quiet moments, connecting the reverent hands that had first inscribed the wisdom with the eager eyes that now received it. The library had become a bridge across centuries, a place where the eternal conversation between seeker and teacher could continue unbroken by the accidents of history. Here, in the careful preservation of human understanding, the deepest hopes of the species found their expression and their fulfillment. And in the growing twilight, as the last scholars closed their books and the last researchers extinguished their lamps, the ancient wisdom settled back into peaceful waiting. It had revealed its secrets to those who were ready to receive them. Now it would rest again, knowing that its purpose had been served, that its long guardianship of human potential was finally bearing fruit in a world that desperately needed the nourishment that only wisdom could provide. The knowledge that was never meant to be found had revealed itself to exactly those who needed to find it. The circle was complete, the transmission accomplished, the ancient promise finally fulfilled. What happened next would depend on those who had received the gift of understanding, on their willingness to become worthy vessels for the wisdom they had inherited, and on their commitment to ensuring that this precious knowledge would never again be lost to the world that so desperately needed its guidance. In the deepest silence of the archive, among scrolls and tablets that held the concentrated essence of human wisdom, eternity touched time and found it good. The past offered its gifts to the future, and the future accepted them with gratitude and resolve. The long chain of transmission that connected seeker to seeker across the generations was forged anew, stronger than ever, ready to carry the light of understanding into whatever darkness the future might hold. Somewhere in the rustling of ancient pages, in the whisper of careful fingers turning leaves of papyrus and parchment, in the soft breathing of scholars bent over texts that revealed new mysteries with each reading, the voice of wisdom itself could be heard. It spoke not in words, but in the quality of attention that genuine understanding required. It communicated not through language, but through the direct transmission of insight from one awakened consciousness to another. The libraries had become temples where the sacred knowledge could be received by minds prepared to understand its significance. The scholars had become priests, serving not gods of stone and bronze, but the living spirit of human wisdom that had somehow managed to survive every catastrophe that had befallen the civilizations that had given it birth. Their reverent study was itself a form of worship, their careful translation an act of devotion to the highest possibilities of human consciousness. And in the growing stillness that settled over those places where ancient wisdom was preserved and studied, something deeper than knowledge began to emerge. It was understanding itself, the living principle that gave meaning to all information, the conscious presence that transformed mere facts into genuine wisdom. It had been waiting through all the centuries of preservation, all the years of careful guardianship, all the patient efforts of those who had kept the sacred knowledge alive. Now, finally, it could emerge from its long concealment. Now, at last, it could speak directly to minds that were prepared to hear its voice. The knowledge that had been hidden was revealing itself as something far more precious than information. It was the very capacity for wisdom itself, the divine principle that allowed consciousness to recognize truth and choose good, to perceive beauty and create meaning. to transcend limitation and realize infinite possibility. This was what the ancient scholars had truly preserved through their patient efforts. Not just texts and techniques, not just methods and maps, but the living essence of human potential itself. They had kept alive the flame of understanding that could illumine any darkness, the spark of insight that could kindle wisdom in any heart, the seed of possibility that could grow into whatever fruit the future required. In the end, as the last, light faded from the windows of the libraries where this precious heritage was housed. The ancient wisdom settled into contented silence. Its work was done, its mission accomplished, its trust fulfilled. The knowledge that was never meant to be found had found exactly those who were meant to find it. The circle of transmission was complete, the chain of understanding unbroken, the sacred trust passed safely from generation to generation. What remained now was not the burden of preservation, but the joy of application. The wisdom that had been kept alive through centuries of patient guardianship was ready to bloom again. In the consciousness of those who had received it, the seeds that had been protected through the long winter of forgetting were ready to sprout in the spring of remembrance. The ancient dream of human enlightenment was preparing to wake from its long sleep and walk again among the children of the earth. And in that waking, in that remembering, in that return of wisdom to a world that had forgotten its own highest nature, the deepest purpose of human existence revealed itself at last. Not conquest, but understanding. Not accumulation, but wisdom. Not power, but service to the greater good that connected all life in one seamless web of mutual support and shared destiny. The texts had been preserved for this moment, this recognition, this awakening to what human beings could become when they remembered what they truly were. The knowledge that was never meant to be found had been found by exactly those who were meant to find it, at exactly the moment when the world most needed what it contained. In this perfect timing, in this sacred synchronicity, the hand of providence could be clearly seen, guiding the long journey from concealment to revelation, from preservation to fulfillment, from ancient wisdom to present possibility. Beneath layers of time that seemed infinite, beneath the accumulated silence of centuries, beneath the patient waiting of minds that had committed their deepest insights to fragile paper and precious ink, something eternal stirred. It was not memory, though memory carried its traces. It was not knowledge, though knowledge preserved its form. It was the living essence of understanding itself, the deathless principle that had always existed and would always exist, finding new expression in each generation that proved worthy of its gifts. The ancient scholars had known this principle intimately. They had served it faithfully, protected it carefully, transmitted it lovingly to future generations who would need its guidance. Their greatest achievement had not been the accumulation of facts or the development of techniques, but the preservation of this living essence through times when darkness threatened to overwhelm the light of human understanding. Now that essence was free to work again in the world, no longer hidden in obscure texts, but alive in awakened consciousness, no longer preserved in ancient libraries, but embodied in contemporary understanding, no longer waiting for discovery, but actively transforming the world through those who had received its gifts. The knowledge that was never meant to be found had completed its long journey from concealment to revelation. The wisdom that had been preserved through centuries of patient guardianship was ready to guide humanity toward its next stage of development. The understanding that had waited through ages of ignorance was finally free to illumine the path toward a more enlightened future. In the deepest stillness of those sacred spaces where ancient wisdom was housed, eternity touched time, and found it transformed. The past had offered its greatest treasures to the future, and the future had proven itself worthy of receiving them. The long work of preservation was complete, the patient labor of transmission accomplished, the sacred trust of the guardians finally fulfilled. What happened next would be written not in ancient texts, but in living experience, not in forgotten languages, but in the universal language of awakened consciousness, not in hidden libraries, but in the open book of human possibility itself. The knowledge that was never meant to be found had been found at last, and in that finding, the world itself was found anew, not as it had been, but as it could become when guided by the highest wisdom the human heart had ever known. Thank you for joining this journey through history that was never meant to be found. If these timeless stories have moved your soul and opened your mind to the hidden chapters of human experience, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others who seek wisdom in the whispers of the past, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you these immersive historical journeys, each one carefully crafted to guide you gently into sleep while expanding your understanding of the rich tapestry of human civilization. Let history's greatest stories find new hearts and minds, just like yours. Subscribe to fall asleep to history and let the past illuminate your dreams with the wisdom of ages.